There is a photograph from 1923 that almost nobody has seen in the last 100 years. A young woman, 17 years old, stands beside a man 25 years her senior on the deck of a ship crossing toward Paris. She is laughing at something outside the frame. He is looking at her the way men in that decade looked at things they intended to keep. Her name, printed once in a Paris society column and then almost nowhere else for the rest of her life, was Gloria Morgan. His name was on half the buildings, railroads, and hotel lobbies in the eastern United States. Vanderbilt. You know the name. Everyone knows the name. You know Consuelo Vanderbilt, forced into a tiara and a title at 18, the girl whose mother literally locked her in a room until she agreed to marry a duke. You may know Alva, the mother who did the locking, later reborn as a suffragette, who chained herself to fences for a cause she once would have found beneath her. You may even know Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the sculptor who built a museum with her own name on it and spent a fortune making sure other people's art outlived her own. These are the Vanderbilt women who got remembered. History kept a seat for them. It did not keep one for Gloria. And that is strange, because for 11 weeks in the autumn of 1934, this woman was the single most discussed private citizen in the United States of America. Newspapers that normally covered war and depression cleared their front pages for her. Radio announcers read updates on her case between commercial breaks. Crowds gathered outside a New York courthouse every single morning hoping for a seat, and when they could not get one, they read the transcripts instead, because the newspapers printed them, nearly verbatim, day after day. A national audience learned words that had never appeared in a family newspaper before. They learned the private nickname of a marchioness. They learned the testimony of a nurse. They learned, or believed they learned, precisely what kind of woman Gloria Vanderbilt was, and the country reached its verdict roughly 2 months before the judge reached his. Then it stopped, not gradually. All at once, the way a radio signal stops when you drive out of range. The woman who had been front-page news for 11 weeks in 1934 became, within a decade, someone people had to be reminded of. By the time she died in 1965, the name Gloria Vanderbilt belonged, in the public mind, to somebody else entirely. Her own daughter, a little girl who had been 10 years old in that courtroom, silent, photographed, discussed as though she were an object in a custody dispute rather than a child, grew up to become one of the most famous women in America, an actual household name, jeans with her signature on the back pocket, in millions of closets. And the mother, who had once eclipsed every other private citizen in the country, vanished so completely from public memory that most people who know the name Gloria Vanderbilt today have never once heard that there were two of them. This is the story the Vanderbilt family never wanted told with any sympathy attached to it. Not because it is scandalous. Plenty of Vanderbilt stories are scandalous, and the family has survived worse. It is because this story does not have a villain the family can safely blame. A court system built to protect children instead became a public spectacle. A family fortune had already begun evaporating by the time anyone married into it, expecting security. A nurse's testimony decided a child's entire future, and her own motives were never fully settled. Two sisters, identical twins, watched their lives split apart so completely that one of them ended up genuinely close to the British throne, while the other ended up genuinely close to nothing at all. And at the center of it sits a woman who was, by any fair reading of the record, failed by nearly everyone who was supposed to protect her, including, at times, herself. We are going to go through this properly, not the 11-week trial as tabloid entertainment, though we will spend real time inside that courtroom, because you cannot understand what happened to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt without sitting through what was said about her there. Start before the Vanderbilt name ever entered her life, with a set of twins born in a Swiss city to a diplomat father who moved his family across half of Europe before either girl turned 10. From there, one twin heads toward a British Viscount and eventually toward the Prince of Wales himself, a connection that changed the entire trajectory of the British monarchy in ways most people have never traced back to her. The other twin, Gloria, heads toward a Vanderbilt heir who was already running out of the thing his name promised. A wedding follows in Paris, one the newspapers covered as a fairy tale, and historians now read as something closer to a transaction between two people who each needed something the other one had. Then a marriage collapses under the weight of alcohol, before either party had time to build anything durable. A young widow, barely into her 20s, tries to hold a life together with a name that opened every door in society and a bank balance that could not actually support the life that name implied. And then a family closes ranks against her, using a court of law to do what family disputes are usually settled by lawyers' letters and silence to do instead. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why the title on your screen says She Died Forgotten. You will also understand, and this matters, exactly where that title needs a small but important correction, because the woman who lived this story deserves the true version of it, and not a slightly more dramatic invented one. She was not, by strict genealogy, Consuelo Vanderbilt's cousin. She married Consuelo's first cousin, which made her family by marriage rather than family by blood, a distinction the Vanderbilts themselves cared about intensely, and one that mattered enormously to how this whole disaster unfolded. And the record does not actually show her dying in a literal boarding house. What the record shows is, if anything, sadder than that, a woman who spent her final decades in a series of small, shrinking, anonymous rented rooms in a city that had once printed her name on every front page it owned, and who died, in 1965, in circumstances so reduced and so quiet that almost nobody outside her immediate family noticed at all. We tell it the way it actually happened. That version does not need embellishment. It is devastating enough on its own. If you are new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel goes deep into the Vanderbilt, Whitney, and Astor world in a way most true crime and royal history channels never bother to. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We read every single one. Start at the beginning. Lucerne, Switzerland, the 23rd of August, 1904. Before we get there though, one piece of context has to sit in your mind for the rest of this video, because without it the entire story reads as a simple morality tale about a reckless woman losing everything, and that is not what happened. By 1923, the year Gloria Morgan married into the family, the great Vanderbilt fortune was already a shadow of what the name suggested to outsiders. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping and railroad magnate everyone called the Commodore, died in 1877, leaving what was, at the time, the largest private fortune ever accumulated by an American. He left nearly all of it to a single son, William Henry Vanderbilt, deliberately starving his other children and grandchildren of the bulk of it in order to keep the money concentrated. William Henry doubled it again before he died 8 years later. Then it began to do what concentrated fortunes almost always do across generations. It split. It split again. It funded palaces on Fifth Avenue and in Newport that cost more to maintain each year than most Americans earned in a lifetime. Nobody in the family adjusted their spending downward to match the divisions. By the time you reach the generation Gloria Morgan married into, the Vanderbilt name still opened every door in the country, but the money behind several of those doors had thinned out considerably, propped up by trusts, mortgaged real estate, and a public reputation for wealth that had outlived the wealth itself in more than one branch of the family. A researcher named Arthur T. Vanderbilt II, himself a descendant, later documented exactly how far this went. In 1973, more than 100 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, an institution the Commodore himself had endowed. Not one person in that room was a millionaire. The family that had once controlled a fortune larger than the entire United States Treasury had, within 4 generations, produced a room full of ordinary Americans carrying an extraordinary name. Gloria Morgan married into that family at almost the exact hinge point of its decline, and she married a man who represented the decline in miniature. Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt did not control a fortune. He controlled a trust, administered by other people, generating an income that sounded enormous to the public and felt, to him, permanently insufficient for the life he insisted on living. He had already burned through one marriage and most of a second by the time he met a 17-year-old girl on a transatlantic crossing and decided, within weeks, that she was the answer to problems he had been creating for himself for 2 decades. Keep that in your head. A fading fortune, a man who had already spent his way through more money than most families see in a century and still felt broke. A young woman who believed, like almost everyone else in the country believed, that the name Vanderbilt meant safety. It did not mean safety. Not for her, and not for the little girl who would be born from that marriage and immediately become one of the most photographed children in America. We start with the twins, because you cannot understand what happened to Gloria without understanding that she spent her entire childhood as one half of a matched set, and that the other half of that set ended up living the exact opposite kind of life. Harry Hayes Morgan worked for the United States Consular Service, which meant his family moved roughly every few years, following his postings across Europe, rather than settling anywhere long enough to put down real roots. His wife, Laura Kilpatrick Morgan, came from a military family with its own claim to old American pedigree, though nothing close to Vanderbilt money. On the 23rd of August 1904, in Lucerne, Switzerland, Laura gave birth to identical twin girls. They named them Gloria and Thelma. From the moment they could walk, the two of them were treated by everyone around them, family, press, and eventually society itself, as a single unit with two faces. Photographs from their childhood show them dressed identically, seated identically, smiling at the same angle toward the same camera, an arrangement their mother apparently encouraged, and one that would follow both girls into adulthood long after any reasonable person would have stopped dressing them alike. The Morgan family's diplomatic postings took them through Belgium, through Germany, through several stops that gave the girls a fluency in continental manners and languages that most American girls their age simply did not have. What the family did not have was money on anything close to the Vanderbilt scale. Harry Hayes Morgan's consular salary provided a comfortable, cultured, thoroughly respectable life. It did not provide a fortune. This distinction mattered enormously to how both twins approached marriage once they came of age, because both of them understood, in the way that only people raised adjacent to real wealth without possessing it can understand, exactly how much a name and a bank account could change a woman's entire position in the world. By their late teens, the twins had become known in the transatlantic society pages under a nickname that followed them for years. The press called them the Magnificent Morgans, a label that captured both their striking, matched appearance and the sense that these two girls were destined for something larger than their father's consular postings could offer. They were beautiful in the specific, symmetrical way that photographs of the era loved, dark-haired, wide-eyed, dressed with a continental sophistication that read as slightly more worldly than the American debutantes they would eventually be compared against. Thelma married first, and young. Her early marriages did not last, and by the early 1920s, she had set her sights considerably higher, eventually marrying Marmaduke Furness, 1st Viscount Furness, a shipping magnate with genuine British aristocratic standing to go alongside his fortune. As Viscountess Furness, Thelma gained entry to a level of British society her American diplomatic upbringing alone never could have unlocked. It was through that entry, in the years that followed, that Thelma became romantically involved with Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII. Their relationship lasted several years and placed Thelma, for a period, at the literal side of the man who would one day sit on the British throne. History remembers what happened next, with a strange irony that almost nobody connects back to the Morgan twins at all. In 1934, while Thelma was traveling in the United States, she asked a friend to look after the prince in her absence. That friend's name was Wallace Simpson. By the time Thelma returned, the prince's attention had transferred entirely, and the woman she had personally introduced into his social circle would go on to become the single most consequential mistress in the history of the British monarchy, the reason a king abdicated his throne. Thelma Morgan, one half of the Magnificent Morgans, spent the rest of her life as a minor footnote to the Wallace Simpson story, the woman who unknowingly handed the future Duchess of Windsor her opening. We mention all of this not as a detour, but because it establishes something essential about the world these two sisters were raised to navigate. Both twins understood marriage, at the level their family occupied, as a vehicle. Not necessarily a cynical one, not without genuine affection involved, but a vehicle nonetheless, a mechanism by which a woman with beauty, manners, and a respectable but insufficient family name could secure a permanently different kind of life. Thelma's vehicle carried her to the edge of the British throne, and then dropped her, gently but permanently, into historical footnote status. Gloria's vehicle carried her somewhere that looked, on paper, considerably more secure: American royalty. The Vanderbilt name. It did not turn out to be secure at all. Gloria met Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt aboard a transatlantic crossing in the early months of 1923. She was 17 years old. He was 42. The math alone tells you something about the era's tolerance for this kind of pairing, but it is worth sitting with for a moment, rather than rushing past it, because a 42-year-old man courting a 17-year-old girl reads very differently to a modern audience than it did to a 1920s society column, and both readings deserve acknowledgement, rather than either being ignored for the sake of a cleaner story. Reginald was, by 1923, already a well-known figure in a particular corner of American high society. The corner built around horse breeding, hard drinking, and the kind of continuous, expensive leisure that Newport, Rhode Island, had perfected as a lifestyle. He was the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and grandson, through that line, of William Henry Vanderbilt, which made him a great-grandson of the Commodore himself and placed him squarely inside the family's most prominent branch. He owned Sandy Point Farm, an estate in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, dedicated substantially to breeding and racing horses, an expensive hobby that consumed money at a rate his trust income struggled to match even before you factor in his drinking. He had already been married twice. His first marriage, to Kathleen Nielsen, had produced a daughter, also named Kathleen, before ending. His second marriage had likewise ended. By the standards of 1920s high society, this made him a man with a history, a reputation, and a track record that any sensible family would have viewed with real caution before allowing a teenage daughter anywhere near him. The Morgan family did not exercise that caution, or did not exercise enough of it. The courtship moved with a speed that, again, reads very differently now than it did then. Within weeks of meeting aboard that ship, Reginald and Gloria were engaged. They married on the 6th of March 1923, in Paris, in a ceremony that the international society press covered with the kind of breathless enthusiasm normally reserved for actual royalty. An American girl, not yet 18, marrying into the most famous fortune in the United States. The story wrote itself, and every newspaper that ran it wrote it as a fairy tale. Nobody wrote the version where a man 25 years older than his bride, with 2 failed marriages and a serious drinking problem behind him, was marrying a teenager who had spent her entire childhood being taught, implicitly and explicitly, that a marriage like this one represented the single greatest achievement available to a woman in her position. Nobody wrote the version where the fortune behind the name had already begun to thin, where Reginald's income depended on trustees who did not always release funds as quickly as his lifestyle required, where the horses at Sandy Point Farm cost more each year than they earned back, where the drinking that had already ended 2 marriages showed no sign of slowing down for a third. They settled, at least nominally, at Sandy Point Farm. Gloria, barely out of her teens, found herself the mistress of a great American estate, married to a man whose habits she could not have fully understood before the wedding and could not fully manage after it. Less than a year into the marriage, on the 20th of February 1924, she gave birth to a daughter in New York City. They named her Gloria as well, after her mother, a choice that would create decades of confusion in the historical record and, more immediately, would create the exact structural problem at the center of this entire story. 2 women, same name, one of them destined to become one of the most famous women in America, the other destined to be almost entirely forgotten by the time the first one reached the height of her fame. For a brief period, perhaps 18 months, the new family had the appearance of stability. Reginald had his heir, or at least his daughter, and the appearance of a settled domestic life to go along with the Vanderbilt name and the Newport estate. It did not last. Reginald's drinking, which had never actually stopped, accelerated. By the middle of 1925, his health had deteriorated to the point where even his own circle recognized the trajectory. On the 1st of September 1925, Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 45 years old. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was a widow before her 21st birthday, with a daughter not yet 2 years old, a Vanderbilt name that still commanded enormous social currency, and an actual financial position that was, once the lawyers and trustees finished sorting through what Reginald had actually left behind, considerably less secure than either the name or the newspapers suggested. This is where the story most people think they know actually begins. Reginald's will and the trust structure behind it left Gloria in an unusual position. She was not destitute. Nobody who married into this branch of the Vanderbilt family in the 1920s ended up destitute in the way that word usually implies. But she was also not wealthy in the way the public assumed a Vanderbilt widow automatically would be. The bulk of Reginald's estate had already been diminished by 2 prior divorce settlements, by years of losses at Sandy Point Farm, and by the drinking that had defined the final years of his life. What remained for Gloria and her infant daughter came primarily through a trust that provided a fixed income rather than a fortune she could freely direct. It was, by ordinary American standards, an extraordinary sum of money. By the standards implied by the name on her daughter's birth certificate, it was noticeably thin. This gap between what the Vanderbilt name suggested and what the actual trust income delivered shaped almost everything that happened to Gloria over the following decade. She continued to live in a manner consistent with her name rather than her actual bank balance, a decision that was partly vanity, partly the simple momentum of a life she had never been taught any other way to live, and partly, perhaps, a genuine belief that the name itself functioned as a kind of unlimited credit line with the world. She spent much of the late 1920s moving through the same transatlantic social circuit her twin sister Thelma occupied. The two of them once again photographed together with a frequency that suggested the public still could not quite tell them apart, or did not particularly want to. Gloria's daughter, meanwhile, spent much of her early childhood in the primary care of an English nurse named Emma Sullivan Keislich, whom the household called Dodo. This was not, on its own, unusual. Wealthy families of the era routinely delegated the daily labor of raising children to nurses and governesses, while parents attended to the demanding business of high society. What made the arrangement significant, in retrospect, was how completely Dodo Keislich came to occupy the emotional center of young Gloria's daily life, and how little the child's mother did to compete for that position. During these years, Gloria formed an intense and unusually close friendship with Nada, Marchioness of Milford Haven, a woman connected by marriage into the extended family of the British royal family itself. The two women became inseparable for stretches of the late 1920s and early 1930s, traveling together, appearing together at social events across Europe and the United States, and drawing the kind of attention that close female friendships among wealthy women of that era sometimes drew. Whether the relationship between Gloria and Nada crossed into romantic territory has never been settled with any documentary certainty. It was alleged, later, in the most damaging possible forum, by witnesses whose credibility and motives were themselves disputed. We will return to those allegations when we reach the courtroom, because that is where they actually mattered, rather than treating them here as settled fact, simply because a 1930s tabloid found them convenient to print. What is documented, rather than merely alleged, is that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Reginald's sister and young Gloria's paternal aunt, grew increasingly concerned during these years about the conditions in which her niece was being raised. Gertrude occupied a completely different position within the Vanderbilt world than her brother ever had. She was, by 1930, one of the wealthiest women in America in her own right, having inherited substantially from both the Vanderbilt and the Whitney sides of her family, married as she was to Harry Payne Whitney. She was also, and this matters enormously for what came next, a serious and accomplished sculptor, the founder of the museum that still carries her family name today, a woman with genuine independent achievements who did not need the Vanderbilt name to justify her place in American cultural life, the way her late brother had needed it to justify his. Gertrude's household, by every contemporary account, offered young Gloria something her mother's household did not: stability, structure, a fixed address, and an aunt whose own accomplishments meant she was not dependent on borrowed glamour to feel significant. The child spent increasing amounts of time at her aunt's residences throughout the early 1930s, a pattern that began, apparently, as ordinary extended family involvement and gradually hardened into something closer to a rival household. By 1933, the tension between mother and aunt over the child's upbringing had reached a point where informal arrangements were no longer sufficient for either side. Gertrude, along with the child's nurse Dodo Kaeslich, had come to believe that young Gloria's home life with her mother was genuinely harmful, marked by frequent travel, inconsistent supervision, and an environment they considered unsuitable for a growing child. Gloria, for her part, viewed her sister-in-law's growing involvement as an escalating intrusion into her rights as a mother, one backed by a fortune and a social position she had no ability to match. In 1934, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney did something that no amount of family disapproval or private disagreement could have accomplished on its own. She filed a legal petition seeking custody of her 10-year-old niece, arguing before a New York court that Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was unfit to continue raising her own daughter. What followed was not a quiet family legal proceeding. It became, within days, the most closely watched trial in the country. The proceedings opened in a New York courtroom in October of 1934, before Justice John Francis Carew of the New York Supreme Court. From the very first morning, the case behaved less like a private custody dispute and more like a public trial of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's entire character, her entire adult life, held open for daily consumption by a country in the middle of the Great Depression that seemed to find, in the spectacle of Vanderbilt money destroying itself from the inside, a strange and undeniable comfort. Consider the timing. 1934 sat deep in the worst economic collapse the country had ever experienced. Millions of Americans stood in breadlines. Families lost homes, farms, entire livelihoods, while banks that had promised safety collapsed around their savings. Into that landscape walked a story about the single wealthiest family name in the nation, tearing itself apart over custody of a 10-year-old heiress, with private nurses and marchionesses and shipping magnates all testifying about a lifestyle so removed from ordinary American experience that it read, to millions of readers, almost like fiction. The newspapers understood exactly what they had. Coverage ran daily, often on front pages, frequently reprinting testimony nearly word for word. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each morning, hoping to secure one of the limited public seats inside. The core legal question was custody of the 10-year-old girl, but the trial functioned, in practice, as an inquiry into whether Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt possessed the moral character required to raise her own daughter. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's legal team built their case around several specific lines of attack, each of which deserves to be examined honestly rather than either accepted wholesale or dismissed wholesale, because the truth of this trial sits somewhere in a genuinely uncomfortable middle ground. The first line concerned Gloria's friendship with Nada, Marchioness of Milford Haven. Opposing counsel worked to establish, through testimony and implication, that the relationship between the two women had crossed from close friendship into something the court and the press of 1934 were prepared to treat as scandalous and disqualifying on its own terms, regardless of whether it had any bearing on the actual quality of Gloria's parenting. This line of attack reflected the deep prejudices of its era, far more than it reflected any established connection between Gloria's private friendships and her daughter's welfare. But in a courtroom in 1934, presided over by a judge and reported by a press corps operating entirely within the moral assumptions of that decade, the mere suggestion did enormous damage, regardless of whether it was ever proven as fact. The second line concerned drinking and general lifestyle, painting Gloria as a woman who prioritized an endless social circuit of European travel, parties, and personal indulgence over the daily presence her daughter needed. Some of this testimony came from household staff, who had direct daily knowledge of the family's routines. Some of it came from society figures whose own motives for testifying, whether personal loyalty to Gertrude or simple appetite for proximity to the biggest story of the year, are impossible to fully separate from the substance of what they said. The third line, and by most later accounts the single most damaging one, came from the child's own nurse, Emma Sullivan Kaeslich, known to young Gloria as Dodo. Kaeslich had spent years as the primary daily caregiver in the child's life, occupying a position closer, in practical terms, to a parent than Gloria herself had occupied for long stretches of the girl's early childhood. When Kaeslich took the stand, she testified in detail about conditions in Gloria's household that she characterized as unstable and unsuitable for a child. Testimony that carried enormous weight precisely because it came from the one adult who had actually been present, day after day, for the ordinary texture of the child's life, in a way that neither the mother's society friends nor the aunt's legal team could claim to have been. There is a genuine and unresolved question, one that biographers and family members have argued over for decades since, about whether Dodo Caselick's loyalty had, by 1934, already shifted decisively toward Gertrude Whitney's household, and whether her testimony reflected an honest accounting of what she had witnessed, or a nurse who had, consciously or not, aligned herself with the parent who offered stability, resources, and an environment she personally judged safer for a child she had come to love as her own. Both readings are plausible. Neither can be proven with the certainty the courtroom of 1934 pretended to have achieved. Gloria's own defense, presented through her attorneys and through her own testimony on the stand, argued that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's petition amounted to nothing less than an attempt by a vastly wealthier relative to purchase custody of a child through superior legal resources and social standing, rather than any genuine failure of maternal fitness. There was real substance to this argument. Gertrude commanded resources for legal representation that Gloria, whatever the public assumed about her wealth, could not match. Gertrude's household did offer more visible, more conventional stability. But stability purchased through overwhelming financial and social advantage is not the same thing as evidence of unfitness in the parent who cannot match it, and Gloria's legal team pressed exactly that distinction throughout the proceedings. The trial also exposed, almost incidentally, the maternal grandmother's position in the dispute. Laura Kilpatrick Morgan, Gloria's own mother, became entangled in allegations and counter-testimony of her own, further complicating a proceeding that had already stopped functioning as a clean two-sided custody dispute and had become instead a sprawling public examination of an entire extended family's private conduct, aired daily for a national audience that had, by that point in the Depression, precious little else to distract itself with. A word on the man who actually decided this case, since a figure this consequential to Gloria's entire remaining life deserves to be more than a name attached to a verdict. John Francis Carew had already built a long public career by the time this trial reached his courtroom, having served for years as a congressman representing a New York district before moving on to the state Supreme Court bench. He was, by every account available, an experienced jurist accustomed to high-profile matters, though nothing in his prior record had prepared the public, or perhaps even Carew himself, for the sheer scale of daily press attention this particular custody dispute would generate. Judges of this era possessed enormous discretion in custody matters, and Carew's own temperament and priorities on the bench, cautious, procedural, unwilling to render the kind of sweeping moral condemnation the newspapers covering his courtroom seemed to expect from him, shaped the actual written ruling considerably more than the tabloid coverage surrounding it ever acknowledged. Justice Carew issued his ruling in November of 1934. He awarded custody of the 10-year-old girl to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, while granting Gloria limited visitation rights, a compromise outcome that the press of the time reported, with varying degrees of accuracy, as a decisive verdict against the mother's character. The judge's actual written findings were narrower and more procedural than the newspaper headlines suggested, focused on questions of stability and daily welfare, rather than delivering the sweeping moral condemnation the public had spent 11 weeks consuming in installment form. But headlines, not judicial opinions, are what the country actually read, and the headlines had already convicted Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt in the court of public opinion long before Justice Carew delivered anything resembling a formal ruling. That distinction matters enormously to everything that came after, and it is worth pausing on directly rather than rushing past it toward the more dramatic material still ahead. A judge's ruling that grants custody to one party while preserving visitation rights for the other is not, in the strict legal sense, a finding that the losing parent is an unfit or dangerous person. It is a finding, narrower and considerably less dramatic, that one household offered greater stability at that specific moment for that specific child. The newspapers of 1934 did not report it that way. They reported it as vindication for Gertrude and condemnation for Gloria, full stop. And an American public reading those headlines over 11 straight weeks absorbed exactly that simplified, more damning version. The gap between what the court actually decided and what the country believed the court had decided is where Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's reputation was truly destroyed, and it was destroyed by a press cycle rather than by a judge's pen. For young Gloria, the 10-year-old at the actual center of this entire spectacle, the trial's outcome meant moving permanently into her aunt's household, a life of considerably greater material and emotional stability than her mother had provided, but one that also meant growing up largely apart from the woman who had given birth to her, under the shadow of a public legal battle that the girl herself had been far too young to understand while it happened, and would spend much of her adult life trying to make sense of afterward. She would write about it, decades later, in her own memoirs, describing the trial's aftermath as a wound that never fully closed, regardless of how comfortable and secure her aunt's household actually turned out to be. For Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the mother, the trial's outcome meant something considerably more final. She had entered 1934 as a Vanderbilt widow with a complicated but genuine claim on the country's fascination. She exited it as a cautionary tale, a name synonymous, for a national audience that had followed every day of testimony, with unfitness, scandal, and a level of personal failure that the actual court record never quite supported, but that the newspaper coverage had permanently attached to her regardless. She was 30 years old. She would live another 3 decades, and for almost the entirety of those 3 decades, the public that had once printed her name on front pages simply stopped paying attention to her altogether. There is a useful comparison to make here, one that the newspapers of 1934 never bothered to draw, but that becomes obvious the moment you step back and look at both Morgan twins side by side. Thelma had already lost her own foothold at the center of British royal life by this point, nudged aside by the very woman she had introduced to the Prince of Wales. Gloria lost her daughter and her reputation in the same 11 weeks. 2 identical sisters, raised in the exact same household with the exact same training in how to convert beauty and manners into permanent security, both watched the men and the institutions they had married toward turn around and hand their most valuable asset to somebody else. Thelma handed the Prince of Wales to Wallis Simpson without ever fully understanding how it happened, until it was already finished. Gloria handed her daughter to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in a New York courtroom, with the entire country watching and taking notes. Neither sister ever fully recovered her former position. Thelma spent her remaining decades as a minor figure at the edges of a story that history now tells almost entirely through Wallis Simpson's perspective, remembered, when she is remembered at all, as the woman who made a fatal mistake by leaving the room. Gloria spent hers even further from the spotlight, because unlike Thelma, whose story at least survives as a footnote inside one of the most famous romances of the 20th century, Gloria's story had no larger narrative willing to carry her name forward at all. She simply stopped being newsworthy. The trial had been the single most talked about private legal case in the country for 11 weeks, and then, once the verdict came down and the child moved into her aunt's household, the newspapers that had covered every session moved on to other subjects entirely, as though an 11-week national obsession could simply be switched off the moment it stopped generating fresh headlines. That is, in fact, more or less exactly what happened. The years immediately following the trial, roughly 1935 through the outbreak of the Second World War, find Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt living a considerably quieter existence than the one that had defined her 20s. Some of this reflects the limited visitation arrangement the court had imposed, which structurally reduced her daily involvement in her daughter's life, regardless of her own wishes. Some of it reflects simple financial reality. The legal costs of an 11-week custody battle against one of the wealthiest women in America had not been small, and Gloria's trust income, already modest by Vanderbilt standards before the trial, had to absorb those costs without any corresponding increase in the underlying principal. She continued to move periodically between New York, Europe, and other social circuits, but the frequency and prominence of her appearances in the society pages declined sharply and permanently after 1934. Where once her comings and goings had generated their own coverage, independent of any connection to the Vanderbilt name, she now appeared, when she appeared at all, primarily as a footnote in stories about her far more famous daughter, or in occasional retrospective pieces revisiting the 1934 trial as history rather than current events. The relationship between Gloria and her daughter, meanwhile, followed a complicated and genuinely painful trajectory that neither the custody verdict nor the intervening years fully resolved. The younger Gloria, raised primarily within Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's household, and later, following Gertrude's death in 1942, largely independent of both her mother and her aunt's direct daily influence, grew into adulthood, carrying the weight of a childhood defined by a court case she had been far too young to fully process while it happened. In her own later writings, she described the relationship with her mother in terms that acknowledged real, if complicated, affection, alongside a permanent and unresolved sense of having been fought over rather than simply raised. There were periods of genuine reconciliation between mother and daughter over the following decades, particularly as the younger Gloria reached adulthood and began to form her own independent judgment about the events of 1934, separate from the version the newspapers and the courtroom had settled on. But reconciliation did not translate into the older Gloria regaining anything resembling her former public standing. By the 1950s, as her daughter's own public profile began to rise, first through a series of marriages that kept the younger Gloria's name in the press, and later through the fashion and design career that would eventually make her genuinely famous in her own right, the older Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt existed almost entirely in her daughter's shadow, a mother whose own dramatic history had once dominated national headlines now known, when she was known at all, primarily as the answer to a trivia question about the more famous Gloria Vanderbilt's early life. It is worth stepping outside the personal story for a moment to look at what the 1934 trial actually did to American legal and journalistic culture, because its influence outlived every person involved in it. Legal historians and family court scholars have returned to the Vanderbilt custody case repeatedly over the decades since, not primarily as a story about one troubled family, but as an early and unusually vivid example of what happens when a private custody dispute is conducted in full public view, with daily newspaper transcripts functioning as a kind of parallel verdict, delivered well before the actual judge reached his. Family court proceedings involving minors are, today, routinely sealed or heavily restricted from public disclosure in most American jurisdictions, a practice that developed gradually over the following decades and that legal historians frequently trace, at least in part, back to the visible damage the Vanderbilt case did, both to the 10-year-old girl at its center and to the adult woman whose entire public reputation was permanently reshaped by testimony, the actual court record treated with far more caution than the newspapers ever did. There is also a harder, more uncomfortable question the case raises, one that goes beyond legal procedure into the basic structure of wealth and justice. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney could afford a legal team, private investigators, and a sustained public relations effort that Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, whatever the public believed about her supposed fortune, simply could not match. Whether the outcome would have differed had both women commanded equal resources is impossible to know with certainty. What is knowable, and what later observers have pointed to repeatedly, is that the imbalance existed, that it shaped what evidence reached the courtroom and how persuasively it was presented, and that a national audience watching daily coverage rarely paused to consider how much of what they were reading reflected genuine truth about a mother's fitness versus how much simply reflected which side could afford the better lawyers. None of this excuses whatever genuine instability existed in Gloria's household during those years, and there is no reason to pretend her parenting during the early 1930s was beyond reasonable criticism. But it does complicate the simple, tidy version of the story that the newspapers sold at the time, the version where a stable, responsible aunt rescued an innocent child from a reckless, unfit mother. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere considerably messier than either side's courtroom presentation allowed for. Back to Gloria's own life, which continued, largely out of public view, through the remainder of the 1930s and into the war years. She did not remarry. Whether by choice, by circumstance, or by some combination of diminished prospects and diminished appetite for another attempt at the kind of life her marriage to Reginald had once promised, She carried the Vanderbilt name for the rest of her life as a widow rather than as anyone's second wife. This detail matters more than it might first appear. The name that had once opened every door in American society, the name that had made her, briefly, more famous than almost any other private citizen in the country, remained legally and socially hers for the following 4 decades. It simply stopped functioning as a key to anything. Financial records from these decades, to the extent biographers and researchers have been able to reconstruct them, show a woman living on a fixed trust income that did not grow to match the cost of the life she continued, out of habit or necessity, to attempt to lead. She moved periodically between smaller residences in New York and occasional stays abroad, a pattern that looked, from a distance, like the ordinary comings and goings of any woman of independent means, but that closer examination shows was increasingly driven by the simple economics of finding accommodations her actual income could sustain. The great houses, the Newport estate, the transatlantic social circuit of her 20s, none of it survived into her middle age in any form she could still afford to participate in. Meanwhile, the daughter at the center of the 1934 trial was growing into exactly the kind of public figure her mother had once briefly been, though by an entirely different route. The younger Gloria Vanderbilt, raised in her Aunt Gertrude's household and later largely independent of both women's direct guidance, became a subject of ongoing press fascination throughout her teenage years and into adulthood, a pattern that the press itself explicitly framed, again and again, through the lens of the custody trial that had made her famous before she was old enough to understand what fame meant. Newspapers of the era coined the phrase, "poor little rich girl," to describe her, a label that followed her for decades and that she would later address directly in her own writing, pushing back against a public image built entirely around an event she had not chosen and could barely remember with any real clarity. By her late teens, the younger Gloria had already begun the string of marriages that would keep her name in the press throughout the 1940s and 50s. First a brief marriage to Hollywood agent Pat DiCicco, then a marriage to the celebrated conductor Leopold Stokowski, decades her senior, echoing, whether anyone at the time consciously noted the parallel or not, the same significant age gap that had defined her own mother's marriage to Reginald Vanderbilt a generation earlier. Later still came a marriage to film director Sidney Lumet, and then, in 1963, a marriage to the writer Wyatt Cooper, with whom she would have 2 sons, one of whom, Anderson Cooper, would grow up to become one of the most recognizable television journalists in the United States. By the early 1960s, in other words, the younger Gloria Vanderbilt was already a genuine public figure in her own right, appearing regularly in society and entertainment coverage, married to a series of prominent men, building toward the design and fashion career that would eventually make her name synonymous with a particular brand of blue jeans sold in department stores across the country. That specific commercial fame, the jeans with her signature stitched onto the back pocket, did not actually arrive until 1978, more than a decade after her mother's death, and it is worth being precise about that timing rather than compressing it for dramatic effect. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt did not live to see her daughter become a literal household name attached to a mass-market product recognized in millions of American homes. What she did live to see, over the final years of her own life, was her daughter becoming a considerably more visible and considerably more sympathetically covered public figure than she herself had been in 3 decades, a woman whose own difficult childhood was increasingly framed by the press as a story of survival and eventual triumph rather than scandal. There is something genuinely difficult to sit with in that contrast, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than a quick move past it. A mother whose reputation had been destroyed, in significant part, by a court battle over her fitness to raise that exact daughter, spent her final years watching that same daughter build a public identity that the press increasingly celebrated. Whatever private reconciliation existed between the 2 women by this point, and the record suggests there was real affection alongside the old wounds, the public framing of their 2 stories had by the 1960s diverged completely. One Gloria was becoming a survivor. The other Gloria had already been filed away, by a public that remembered her only vaguely if at all, as a cautionary tale from 3 decades earlier. Her twin sister Thelma, meanwhile, followed her own parallel arc toward obscurity during these same years, though along a somewhat gentler curve. Having lost her position at the center of British royal life to Wallis Simpson in the mid-1930s, Thelma spent her remaining decades largely removed from the transatlantic social prominence that had once defined both twins together. She lived into the early 1970s, outliving Gloria by several years, but her later decades brought nothing resembling a return to the public relevance either sister had briefly commanded in their youth. When she died, in 1970, the coverage treated her primarily as a historical footnote to the abdication crisis, the woman who had unknowingly opened the door for Wallis Simpson, rather than as a significant figure in her own right. Two identical sisters, born within minutes of each other in a Swiss city in 1904, both eventually reduced by history to supporting roles in stories that centered, in the end, on other women entirely, Wallis Simpson on one side, and on the other, Gloria's own daughter. This is a good place to settle a question you may already be asking, because it deserves a straight answer rather than a vague one. In what sense was Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt actually Consuelo Vanderbilt's cousin? The honest answer is that she was not a blood relative of Consuelo at all. Consuelo, the famous Duchess of Marlborough, was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, and her actual first cousins by blood were the children of William Kissam's siblings, Cornelius Vanderbilt II among them. Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt, the man Gloria married, was one of those children, a genuine first cousin to Consuelo by blood. Gloria became family the way millions of women have become family across every generation, not through birth but through marriage, which made her, in the strict genealogical sense, Consuelo's cousin by marriage, rather than her cousin by blood. This distinction mattered enormously inside the Vanderbilt world itself, a family that kept meticulous track of exactly whose blood carried the name and whose connection to it had arrived through a wedding ring instead. It is worth naming clearly here, rather than letting the title of this video imply something the historical record does not actually support. Gloria married into Consuelo's family. She did not share Consuelo's ancestors. Both things can be true, and only one of them is accurate. Consider, though, what the two women's lives looked like sitting side by side, cousins by marriage who almost certainly crossed paths at family gatherings during the 1920s, both young brides who had married considerably older, wealthier men bearing the Vanderbilt name, both discovering, in their own very different ways, exactly how much that name could cost a woman once the marriage that brought it to her stopped protecting her. Consuelo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough had been a forced, loveless arrangement from the start, engineered entirely by her mother Alva for the sake of a title. It nonetheless eventually delivered Consuelo into a second act, following her divorce from the Duke, that the public and history both treated with genuine sympathy and even a kind of triumphant redemption. She remarried, this time by her own choice, to a French aviator named Jacques Balsan, and she spent her later decades as a celebrated philanthropist and society figure on both sides of the Atlantic, her early suffering reframed by history as the origin story of a woman who eventually claimed her own life back. When Consuelo Vanderbilt died, on the 6th of December 1964, in New York, obituaries around the world marked the passing of one of the last great figures of the Gilded Age, a duchess, a philanthropist, a woman whose entire biography had been treated, by that point, as a matter of historical record worth preserving in detail. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt died the following year, in 1965. There was no comparable obituary, there was no comparable historical record kept. Two women, connected by marriage into the same family, both trapped young in arrangements shaped by wealth and expectation, rather than free choice, both eventually stripped of the security that marriage into the Vanderbilt name had seemed to promise. One of them got a second act, a title she outlived, philanthropic honors, and a death that the entire world paused briefly to acknowledge. The other got 11 weeks of the most intense press coverage a private citizen in America had ever received, followed by 3 decades of almost complete public silence, and a death that almost nobody noticed at all. That is the actual shape of this story, and it is considerably more interesting and considerably sadder than a simple tale about a woman losing a fortune she never actually had in the first place. The final decade of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's life, roughly 1955 through 1965, is the thinnest documented period of her entire biography, and that thinness is itself the most eloquent evidence available for how completely she had faded from public relevance. A woman whose every movement had once been tracked by international society columns simply stopped generating enough interest for anyone to bother recording where she lived, who she saw, or how she spent her days. Biographers reconstructing this period have had to rely primarily on scattered family recollections, occasional court and probate records, and the retrospective accounts her daughter and other relatives provided decades later, rather than on the dense contemporary press coverage that documents almost every other phase of her earlier life in exhaustive detail. What that reconstruction does show is a woman living in progressively smaller quarters, funded by a trust income that had not meaningfully grown since the 1920s, while the cost of maintaining any semblance of her old life had, like everything else in post-war America, steadily risen. She moved between rented apartments in New York, at times close enough to real financial strain that family members stepped in, privately, to help cover expenses, a private arrangement that never became public in the way her 1934 custody battle had, because by this point, almost nobody outside her immediate family was paying close enough attention to notice. This is the point where the title of this video needs its second and final correction, and it deserves to be stated plainly, rather than glossed over. The historical record does not actually document Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt dying in a literal boarding house, the kind of shared lodging house associated with working-class tenants and transient residents that the phrase specifically evokes. What the record does document is something that, in its own way, cuts just as deep. A woman who had once been introduced to newspaper readers as a Vanderbilt, a name synonymous with the grandest private residences in American history, spent her final years in small, modest, rented apartments that had nothing whatsoever in common with Sandy Point Farm or the great Fifth Avenue mansions her married name once implied. She was not homeless, and she was not destitute in the way that word usually implies. She was simply, permanently diminished, living a life that any ordinary middle-class American family of the era would have recognized as comfortable enough, but that stood in such stark contrast to the fortune her name still suggested to strangers that the gap itself became its own kind of quiet tragedy. She died in 1965, in New York, at the age of 60. The exact circumstances of her final illness are not well documented in any source, with the kind of verified detail this channel insists on, before presenting something as settled fact. And rather than filling that gap with an invented deathbed scene, the way a less careful account might, we are going to leave it exactly where the honest record leaves it, acknowledged and incomplete. What is documented is that her death received only modest press coverage, a handful of paragraphs in a small number of newspapers, most of which identified her primarily, and in some cases exclusively, as the mother of the increasingly famous Gloria Vanderbilt, rather than as a subject worth covering in her own right. The woman whose custody trial had once commanded front-page coverage for 11 straight weeks received, at her death, roughly the same column space a minor local obituary might have earned. Her daughter, by this point 30 years old, already deep into the marriages and the emerging career that would eventually make her one of the most recognizable women in America, attended to the arrangements. Whatever reconciliation had or had not been fully achieved between mother and daughter across 3 decades of complicated, wound-laden history, the younger Gloria ensured her mother was not buried in complete anonymity. But the funeral itself, by every available account, was a small, quiet, family affair. Nothing remotely resembling the scale of attention that had once surrounded every public appearance this same woman made during her brief years at the absolute center of American celebrity. In her own later writing, the younger Gloria Vanderbilt returned repeatedly to the subject of her mother, across multiple memoirs published over the following decades. She did not write a simple villain's portrait, and she did not write a simple redemption story either. What emerges across her published reflections is something closer to genuine, unresolved grief. A daughter who spent much of her adult life trying to understand a mother she had been legally separated from at 10 years old, in circumstances neither of them had chosen, and neither of them had ever been able to fully discuss with each other while there was still time. She described her mother, in various interviews and writings across her long life, with a mixture of tenderness and lingering sorrow that suggested the 1934 trial had wounded both women permanently, in different ways, regardless of which side the court had favored. It is worth remembering, too, that the younger Gloria did not escape her own inheritance of instability entirely. Her son Carter Cooper died by his own hand in 1988, a tragedy she wrote about with unflinching honesty in a later memoir, and one that adds another layer of genuine sorrow to a family history that had already absorbed more than its fair share by the time the 20th century ended. The Vanderbilt name, across 4 full generations by this point, had accumulated a weight of private grief that no amount of remaining money or remaining fame could fully offset. Step back now and place Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's individual story against the larger pattern this channel has traced across several of the great American fortunes, and a familiar shape emerges. Great wealth concentrates in one generation, usually through ruthless, singular focus of the kind the Commodore himself embodied. It disperses across the following generations, divided among children and grandchildren whose personal habits rarely adjust downward to match their shrinking share. And somewhere in that dispersal, almost every single time, a woman who married into the name for security discovers that the security was never as solid as the name implied, that trusts controlled by male relatives and trustees could be tightened or contested in ways she had little power to prevent, and that her own place inside the family, unlike her husband's or her children's, depended entirely on a marriage that ended, one way or another, considerably sooner than anyone had planned for. Remember that 1973 reunion at Vanderbilt University, the one where more than 100 descendants gathered, and not one of them was a millionaire. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt did not live to see that reunion. She died 8 years too early. But her own life, viewed honestly, was an early preview of exactly what that reunion later confirmed on a much larger scale. The name Vanderbilt, by the middle of the 20th century, had already stopped functioning as a reliable guarantee of anything at all. It functioned instead as a kind of inherited obligation, a reputation the family had to keep performing in public, regardless of whether the private financial reality behind any individual Vanderbilt still matched the performance. Gloria performed that obligation for 11 weeks in front of the entire country, in a courtroom, under oath, while lawyers picked apart her friendships, her parenting, and her character. And then, having failed that particular performance in the eyes of a national audience that had never met her and would forget her within a decade regardless of the verdict, she spent the rest of her life permanently released from any further obligation to perform at all, because nobody was watching anymore. Return, for a moment, to the courtroom itself, because there is more worth understanding about exactly how this trial functioned as spectacle before we move on to its long aftermath. Photographers camped outside the courthouse every single morning for 11 weeks, and the 10-year-old girl at the center of the case became, alongside her mother, one of the most photographed children in America during those months. Images from the period show her arriving at the courthouse in a small coat, flanked by adults, expression carefully neutral in the way children learn to arrange their faces when enough adults around them have made clear that cameras are watching and reactions will be judged. She rarely spoke publicly during the proceedings, her own voice largely absent from a national conversation that was, in the strictest legal sense, entirely about her future. Nada, Marchioness of Milford Haven, whose friendship with Gloria had become one of the central pieces of testimony used against her, occupied an unusual position in all of this. She was a woman with genuine connections deep into European royal circles, related by marriage into a family that would, within a generation, produce a husband for the future Queen Elizabeth II. Her presence in the case gave the whole spectacle an extra layer of transatlantic glamour that the American press could not resist, a marchioness testifying, implicitly if not always explicitly, about the private life of a Vanderbilt widow in a New York courtroom, while a Depression-era public devoured every word. The witnesses called across the 11 weeks numbered in the dozens, ranging from household staff to family friends, to expert observers on childhood welfare, each contributing a small piece to a portrait of Gloria's household that the aggregate testimony painted in considerably darker tones than any single witness's account, taken alone, would have supported. This is a pattern worth naming explicitly, because it recurs constantly in trials that become public spectacles. Individual pieces of testimony, each modest and each open to alternative interpretation, accumulate under sustained media coverage into something that feels, by the time a verdict arrives, far more damning and far more certain than the individual pieces actually were. By the time Justice Carew delivered his ruling, the public had already spent 11 weeks constructing its own verdict, day by day, headline by headline, largely independent of whatever nuance the actual courtroom testimony contained. The judge's decision simply confirmed, in the public mind, a story the newspapers had already finished telling. There is a pattern here that stretches back a full generation earlier in this same family, one that anyone who has followed this channel's earlier coverage of Consuelo Vanderbilt's own life will recognize immediately. Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, famously locked her teenage daughter in a room and refused to let her out until the girl agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough, a marriage Alva had engineered entirely for the social prestige a title would bring the family, with almost no regard for what her daughter actually wanted. 4 decades later, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, wielding a fortune and a legal team rather than a locked bedroom door, removed a different young Vanderbilt woman from her mother's care, again in the name of what an older, wealthier matriarch judged best for a younger woman's future, again with limited regard for what that younger woman herself might have wanted, had anyone with real power in the situation thought to ask her directly. The two situations are not identical. Alva's actions look, by any modern standard, considerably closer to outright cruelty than Gertrude's did, and Gertrude at least had the benefit of a court proceeding, however flawed, rather than a locked door and a threatened suicide watch, which is the method by which Alva reportedly broke her daughter's resistance. But the underlying structure repeats itself with a consistency that is genuinely striking once you notice it. Powerful Vanderbilt women, across multiple generations, repeatedly exercised near total control over the lives of younger, less powerful Vanderbilt women, always in the stated name of protecting the family's interests, its reputation, or the younger woman's own supposed welfare, and always in ways that left the younger woman with almost no actual say in the outcome. Consuelo eventually escaped her forced marriage and built a second life she genuinely chose for herself. Gloria never got an equivalent second act. She never remarried, never rebuilt a public position, never found her own version of the French aviator and the philanthropic decades that gave Consuelo's later life its shape. Whether that difference reflects something about the two women's individual circumstances, their personalities, their financial resources, or simply the arbitrary unfairness of which scandal a given decade's newspapers decide to forgive, and which one they decide to punish permanently, is a question this channel cannot answer with certainty. What can be said with certainty is that both women were, at different points in their lives, treated by their own family as assets to be managed, rather than as adults, entitled to make their own decisions, and only one of the two ever fully escaped that treatment. It would be convenient and dramatically satisfying to end this thread with a clean moral: wealthy families destroy the women who marry into them, full stop. The actual record resists that kind of tidy conclusion. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was not, by any serious reading of the evidence, a villain manufacturing a false case for cruel or selfish reasons. She was a woman who had watched a young child's home life closely enough over several years to reach a genuine and probably defensible conclusion that intervention was warranted. The tragedy of this story is not that a villain destroyed an innocent woman. The tragedy is that a genuinely difficult, genuinely ambiguous family dispute, the kind that plays out in family courts across the country every single year, without anyone outside the immediate family ever hearing about it, happened to involve people wealthy and famous enough that an entire nation turned it into public entertainment, and that the entertainment version of the story, simplified, sensationalized, and printed in daily installments, permanently outlived the more complicated truth underneath it. One more figure from the trial deserves a closing note before we move into the final chapter of this story, because her fate says almost as much about the whole affair as anyone else's. Dodo Caselick, the nurse whose testimony had done such significant damage to Gloria's case, remained a fixture in the younger Gloria's life for years afterward, continuing in her role within Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's household well past the trial's conclusion. In later interviews and writings, The younger Gloria described her relationship with Dodo in terms that acknowledged real, lasting affection, the bond of a child, raised largely by one consistent, present adult in a childhood otherwise defined by legal upheaval and shifting households. Whatever judgment history eventually renders on Dodo Caselick's courtroom testimony, whether it reflected honest concern for a child's welfare, or a nurse who had simply attached herself to the wealthier, more stable side of a family dispute, the woman herself remained, by every account, a genuinely important and genuinely loved presence in the daughter's life for years to come. That detail matters because it completes the picture of exactly how thoroughly the household built around young Gloria after 1934 replaced the household she had been removed from. New primary caregiver, already established. New primary residence, already familiar. New financial security, already vastly superior to anything her mother could offer. The court had not asked this 10-year-old girl to build an entirely new life from nothing. It had asked her to formalize a transition that had, in practical terms, already been underway for months or years before the trial ever reached a judge, a slow drift toward her aunt's household that the courtroom simply made official and permanent. For Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the mother left on the losing side of that transition, none of this nuance mattered in any way that improved her own daily reality. Whatever legitimate concerns had motivated her sister-in-law, whatever genuine stability her daughter gained from the outcome, Gloria herself experienced the verdict as the single defining loss of her adult life. The moment everything she had built her identity around since marrying Reginald Vanderbilt at 17 years old was formally taken away from her, in public, with the entire country watching and largely siding against her. She carried that loss for 30 years. She carried the Vanderbilt name for 30 years too, a name that had cost her, by any honest accounting, far more than it had ever given her. She married into American royalty at 17. She buried her husband at 21. She lost her only child at 30, in a courtroom, in front of the entire nation. And then she simply disappeared from public view, not through any dramatic final act, but through the slow, ordinary process by which a country's attention moves on and never quite comes back. There is one final, almost cruel irony worth sitting with before we move forward into the last chapter of Gloria's life, because it explains, better than anything else in this story, exactly how she came to be erased so completely. She did not simply fade from public memory the ordinary way, through the slow passage of decades and the natural turnover of who a culture chooses to remember. She was erased twice over by the same three words: Gloria Vanderbilt. Her daughter carried that exact name forward into a level of fame the mother had only briefly touched, a name that would eventually sit on the label of a perfume bottle, on the back pocket of blue jeans sold in shopping malls across the country, on magazine covers for 6 full decades. Every single time those three words appeared in American culture from the 1970s onward, they pointed toward the daughter, the mother who had carried that same name first, who had been born with a different name entirely, and had earned the Vanderbilt part of it through a marriage that cost her almost everything, simply stopped being who the name meant. Ask most Americans today who Gloria Vanderbilt was, and you will get an answer about jeans, about fashion, about a famous son who became a familiar face on the evening news. You will rarely, if ever, get an answer about a 17-year-old bride, a widow at 21, a mother who lost a custody battle that once obsessed an entire nation, and who died largely alone in 1965, having spent her final decade in rooms considerably smaller than the ones the newspapers once assumed she still lived in. That is the whole tragedy compressed into a single fact. The name survived. The woman it originally belonged to did not. Before we move into the final years of Gloria's life, and the last, quietest chapter of this story, hit subscribe if you have not already, and turn on those notifications, because we are building an entire archive on this channel, covering exactly these forgotten corners of America's great fortunes, the women history remembers only as footnotes to somebody else's name. Drop a comment letting us know which other old money family you want us to dig into next. We read every single one of them, and a good number of our recent scripts have started life as a suggestion sitting right there in the comments section. Now, back to 1965, and the quiet end of a life that had once been the loudest story in America. To understand exactly what Gloria married into on that Paris morning in 1923, it helps to step back into Newport, Rhode Island, the specific stage on which the Vanderbilt name performed itself most extravagantly during the decades before her arrival. By the 1890s, Newport's Bellevue Avenue had become a corridor of what its own residents, without apparent irony, called cottages, vast stone and marble palaces built as summer residences and occupied for perhaps 6 to 8 weeks a year, each one designed to outdo the last in scale and ornamentation. The breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Reginald's own father, ran to 70 rooms and required a staff of dozens simply to keep functioning during its brief annual season of use. Marble House, built for William Kissam and Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's parents, cost an amount that would be almost unimaginable in contemporary terms. Its ballroom gilded floor to ceiling, its very existence a deliberate, calculated statement of the family's arrival at the absolute pinnacle of American wealth. Reginald grew up adjacent to this world, the son of the family that had literally built its most famous monument, and he inherited, along with an actual trust income, an entire set of expectations about what a Vanderbilt life was supposed to look like on a daily basis. Sandy Point Farm, the Portsmouth estate where he settled with Gloria, was smaller and less architecturally famous than his father's breakers, but it operated on the same underlying assumption that a Vanderbilt household existed to be maintained at a scale well beyond ordinary necessity, staffed generously, stocked with fine horses, and run as though the family fortune that had built it would simply continue renewing itself indefinitely, the way it had for the 2 generations before Reginald's own. It would not continue renewing itself indefinitely, and Reginald's own life is one of the clearest individual illustrations of exactly why. His trust income, substantial by any ordinary measure, existed within a family structure that had already divided the original Commodore's fortune across dozens of descendants by the time it reached him, each division shrinking what any single heir actually controlled. Layer onto that division a genuinely serious drinking problem, 2 expensive divorce settlements before his marriage to Gloria even began, and an ongoing commitment to horse breeding and racing at a scale that consistently outpaced its own returns, and you arrive at a man who carried one of the most recognizable surnames in American history while living, in strictly financial terms, considerably closer to the edge than either his bride or the watching public understood on the day they married. This is the gap this entire story keeps circling back to, because it is the gap that actually explains everything that followed. The Vanderbilt name, by 1923, had become a kind of performance that increasingly outran the balance sheet supporting it. Gloria Morgan married the performance. She discovered the balance sheet only gradually, in pieces, first as a young widow sorting through what her husband had actually left behind, and later, far more painfully, as a defendant in a courtroom where opposing counsel argued, in effect, that she had failed to maintain a level of stability the family's own diminishing resources had made considerably harder to sustain than the public ever understood. The scramble over Reginald's estate following his death in 1925 was not, in itself, a public spectacle, on anything like the scale the 1934 custody trial would later become, but it set the financial terms that shaped everything Gloria would face over the following decade. Reginald's will divided his remaining assets among his 3 living children, the daughter from his first marriage, and the infant Gloria from his marriage to Gloria Morgan, with trust provisions administered by appointed trustees rather than handed directly to either mother. This was standard practice for wealthy families of the era, a structural safeguard meant to protect a fortune from being spent too quickly by any one generation. It also meant that Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, as the surviving widow, did not gain direct control over the money her daughter would eventually inherit. She received her own income through separate provisions, income that, as already discussed, proved considerably less generous than either the Vanderbilt name or the newspapers of the period assumed. This was, in a sense, the family doing exactly what it had done once before, nearly 50 years earlier, when the Commodore himself died in 1877 and left almost his entire fortune to a single son, while providing comparatively little to his other children, including a son named Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, who contested the will in a court battle that became, in its own era, a genuine newspaper sensation, complete with allegations that the aging Commodore had been manipulated by spiritualists and mediums in his final years. Cornelius Jeremiah lost that fight, spent the following years in increasingly desperate financial circumstances, despite carrying one of the wealthiest names in America, and died by his own hand in 1882, alone and in debt, in a New York hotel room. The pattern should sound familiar by now. A family fortune, structured deliberately to concentrate rather than distribute evenly, generates recurring disputes across generations. Disputes that regularly end up in courtrooms, regularly generate enormous public fascination, and regularly leave at least one family member considerably worse off than the Vanderbilt name would have led any outside observer to expect. Reginald's own trust arrangements did not produce a public court battle the way his great-uncle's will once had, but they produced the same underlying result on a smaller scale, a family member carrying the name without commanding anything close to the resources that name implied to the world. Gloria's own legal battles with the estate trustees over the years that followed, seeking adjustments to her income and, later, defending her position as her daughter's mother against her sister-in-law's petition, never received the historical documentation that either the 1870s will contest or the 1934 custody trial did, precisely because they were smaller, quieter, more ordinary disputes of the kind that families with far less money resolve through lawyers' letters every single day without anyone outside the family ever hearing about it. It was only when the dispute crossed from private financial disagreement into a public custody petition, argued in open court, with a 10-year-old child's future formally at stake, that the country's attention turned toward this branch of the family, with the same intensity it had once turned toward the Commodore's own children fighting over his estate. It helps, too, to place the 1934 custody trial inside the broader media landscape of its exact moment, because the country's appetite for this kind of spectacle did not appear in isolation. Just months after the Vanderbilt verdict came down, the nation turned its collective attention to another trial that would come to define Depression-era tabloid culture even more completely: the prosecution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann for the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby, a case that dominated newspapers throughout 1935, with the same daily transcript coverage, the same crowds outside courthouses, the same sense of an entire country pausing its ordinary concerns to consume a single family's private catastrophe in serialized form. Historians of American media have long noted that the 1930s produced an unusually intense appetite for exactly this kind of trial, private tragedy transformed into public entertainment, and have offered several overlapping explanations for why. Radio had matured into a genuine mass medium, capable of delivering updates within hours, rather than waiting for the next morning's paper. Newspaper circulation, in a country desperate for any distraction from unemployment lines and bank failures, had strong commercial incentive to stretch a single dramatic story across as many editions as the facts, or the appearance of facts, could sustain. And there was, underneath all of it, a genuine and understandable public fascination with watching wealthy, famous families suffer the same kinds of private catastrophes: infidelity, addiction, custody disputes, grief, that ordinary families suffered too. Evidence that money did not, in fact, buy immunity from the basic difficulties of being human. The Vanderbilt custody trial delivered that evidence in an unusually vivid and unusually well-documented form. A family carrying the single most recognizable fortune in the country, tearing itself apart over the exact same question, who should raise this child, that any ordinary divorced or widowed family might face in a courtroom with none of the press attention, and none of the trustees, and none of the marchionesses. The country consumed the story precisely because it offered both spectacle and a strange kind of reassurance at once. Look, the coverage seemed to whisper beneath its surface, even the Vanderbilts cannot buy their way out of this particular kind of pain. That reassurance came at Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's direct personal expense, and it is worth naming that transaction plainly. A struggling nation found genuine comfort in watching a Vanderbilt widow's private life dismantled in public, and once the entertainment value of that dismantling had been fully extracted, the same public that had followed every session simply moved on, leaving the actual woman at the center of it to live out the following 3 decades in whatever diminished circumstances the verdict and the coverage had left her with. The story did eventually return to public attention, though not until long after Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt herself had died and could no longer respond to how it was told. In 1980, the journalist and author Barbara Goldsmith published a comprehensive account of the entire affair, drawing on court records, contemporary press coverage, and interviews with surviving family members and witnesses, giving the case its first serious historical treatment, removed from the breathless daily coverage of 1934 itself. The book became a bestseller, and 2 years later, in 1982, it was adapted into a television miniseries that brought the story to an entirely new generation of American viewers, casting some of the era's most respected actresses in the roles of the trial's central women. For a brief period, the country that had once obsessively followed this story in real time and then almost entirely forgotten it, rediscovered the case as history, packaged now as prestige drama rather than daily tabloid installment. Even that rediscovery, though, centered the story primarily around the child at its heart and the dramatic courtroom conflict between two powerful women, Gloria the mother and Gertrude the aunt, rather than dwelling on what actually happened to Gloria in the 3 decades of quiet obscurity that followed the verdict. The miniseries, like the book it was based on, ends its narrative interest almost entirely at the courtroom doors. What came after, the small apartments, the dwindling trust income, the slow slide out of public relevance entirely, received comparatively little attention even in this more serious historical retelling, a pattern that has held, more or less, ever since. The trial remains a fixture of true crime and celebrity history retrospectives. The woman's actual final 3 decades remain almost entirely undocumented outside the narrowest specialist biographical research. The fullest, most direct public reckoning with Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's story actually came from her own daughter, very late in the daughter's own long life. In 2016, the cable network HBO aired a documentary titled Nothing Left Unsaid, built around extended conversations between the younger Gloria Vanderbilt, by then in her 90s, and her son, Anderson Cooper, the television journalist. Across that documentary, the elder Gloria Vanderbilt spoke with unusual candor about her own childhood, the custody trial, her complicated feelings toward her mother, and the lifelong effort to separate the version of her early life the public had consumed as scandal from the considerably more human, more painful version she herself had actually lived through. It is close to a final word on the entire affair, as anyone directly connected to it ever offered, a 90-something-year-old woman, one of the most famous people in America, still working through a wound that had first opened when she was 10 years old, sitting in a courtroom while adults argued about which of them deserved her. The younger Gloria Vanderbilt died on the 17th of June 2019, at the age of 95, having lived a life so much longer and so much more publicly documented than her own mother's, that the imbalance between the two women's historical footprints only grew more extreme with each passing decade. Her death received extensive coverage across every major American news outlet, tributes from designers, journalists, and public figures who had followed her decades-long career, a life fully and thoroughly recorded, from beginning to end, in a way her mother's never was, and, at this point, never will be. Go back, for a moment, to that Paris wedding itself, because the coverage it received at the time tells you almost as much about the era as it does about the two people actually getting married. American and European society papers alike ran the story with the specific vocabulary reserved for fairy tales, an American girl, barely out of her teens, marrying into the fortune that had, for 2 full generations, functioned in the popular imagination as the closest thing the United States had to actual royalty. The coverage dwelt, predictably, on the Vanderbilt name and on Reginald's Newport pedigree, and largely skated past the details that a more skeptical readership might have flagged: his age relative to hers, his 2 prior marriages, the pattern of financial strain already visible to anyone inside his actual circle of trustees and creditors, rather than his circle of society column readers. This gap between press coverage and private reality would define nearly every major turning point in Gloria's life over the following decade, and it is worth naming as its own pattern, rather than treating each instance as an isolated coincidence. The wedding was covered as fairy tale, while the groom's finances strained under debts the coverage never mentioned. The marriage was covered as a settled, stable Vanderbilt household, while Reginald's drinking accelerated behind closed doors at Sandy Point Farm, and later, the custody trial was covered as a clear moral verdict against an unfit mother, while the actual judicial ruling sat considerably narrower and more procedural than the headlines let on. Every major chapter of this story arrived to the public, wrapped in a version simpler and more dramatic than the truth underneath it, and Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt spent her entire adult life absorbing the consequences of gaps the public itself never had reason to notice, because the public was never shown the gaps in the first place. Life at Sandy Point Farm, in the brief period between the wedding and Reginald's death, settled into a rhythm shaped almost entirely around the horse breeding and racing operation that consumed both Reginald's attention and his money. Newport's social calendar during these years still carried real weight among the families who had built their summer palaces along Bellevue Avenue a generation earlier, though the post-war decade had already begun to soften some of the extravagance that had defined the 1890s and the years just before the First World War. A young bride arriving into that world at 17, with a continental upbringing but no direct prior experience of American Gilded Age society at its most concentrated, would have found herself navigating an entire set of unwritten social rules, precedents, etiquette, and expectation, largely without the benefit of a mother-in-law or an older female relative from her husband's side, actively guiding her through it. Reginald's own mother had died years earlier, and his sister Gertrude, the same woman who would later petition for custody of Gloria's daughter, occupied her own separate and considerably more independent orbit within the family, one built around her sculpture, her museum project, and her marriage into the Whitney fortune, rather than around close involvement in her brother's domestic arrangements. That absence of guidance, of an older woman inside the family actively invested in helping the new young bride succeed in her role, would prove significant later when the very same sister-in-law who had offered Gloria little support during the marriage's brief existence became the person arguing, in open court, that Gloria had failed to meet the standards a Vanderbilt household required. Reginald's decline through the summer of 1925 followed a trajectory that his own circle had watched play out before, twice, across his two prior marriages, though it moved with unusual speed this final time. Cirrhosis of the liver, the disease that killed him, does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates across years of sustained heavy drinking, and by the accounts that survive from those closest to the household, Reginald's health had been visibly deteriorating for months before his death on the 1st of September, at Sandy Point Farm, at the age of 45. Gloria, not yet 21 years old, found herself widowed with an infant daughter, not yet 2, in a household built around an operation, the horse breeding business, that had depended entirely on her husband's continued presence and continued, if strained, income to function. The months immediately following Reginald's death brought Gloria into direct contact, for the first time in any sustained way, with the practical machinery of Vanderbilt family wealth, the trustees, the lawyers, the estate accountants whose job was to divide what remained of Reginald's holdings according to the terms of his will, while protecting the interests of all 3 of his children, including the daughter from his first marriage, who had no direct relationship with Gloria at all. This process, ordinary as estate administration goes, nonetheless left the young widow acutely aware, for perhaps the first time, of exactly how much distance existed between the Vanderbilt name she now carried and the actual financial resources available to her personally as a widow rather than as a wife. It was in the years immediately following, as Gloria rebuilt a social life for herself, as a young widow moving through the transatlantic circuit her sister Thelma also occupied, that her friendship with Nada, Marchioness of Milford Haven, deepened into the closeness that would later become so central to the custody trial. Nada was, by birth, considerably closer to actual European royalty than anyone in the Vanderbilt or Morgan families could claim, descended through her mother from the Russian imperial family, a genuine Romanov connection by blood, and married into the Mountbatten family through her husband George, the second Marquis of Milford Haven, a family that sat at the very center of the extended British and European royal network. For a young American widow whose own family had built its social position on diplomatic postings and a fortune that had married in rather than been born into, A friendship this close with a woman of Nada's genuine aristocratic pedigree carried enormous social value, quite apart from whatever personal affection existed between the two women. That personal affection, whatever its true nature, became one of the central battlegrounds of the 1934 trial, examined and cross-examined by lawyers operating within the deeply restrictive social and legal attitudes of their decade. Nothing in the surviving record proves definitively what the relationship actually was, beyond a close, sustained, and evidently genuine friendship between two women who spent considerable time together across several years. What the record does show clearly is how effectively opposing counsel weaponized the mere suggestion of impropriety, understanding correctly that a 1934 judge, jury of public opinion, and press corps would treat even an unproven implication as damaging enough on its own to shape the outcome, regardless of whether it had any actual bearing on Gloria's fitness as a mother. It is worth understanding, too, the broader legal landscape American custody law occupied in 1934, because the rules Gloria's case operated under were themselves in the middle of a significant, decades-long transition. For most of the 19th century, American custody law had generally presumed that fathers held primary rights to their children, a legal inheritance of English common law tradition that treated children, in effect, as belonging to the paternal line by default. By the early 20th century, that presumption had shifted substantially toward what courts increasingly called the tender years doctrine, a legal standard holding that young children, particularly, generally benefited from remaining with their mother, absent clear evidence of unfitness. On paper, this shift should have worked in Gloria's favor as the surviving mother of a young daughter. In practice, the tender years doctrine had never been an absolute rule, and courts retained enormous discretion to weigh a mother's fitness against a range of factors that, viewed through a contemporary lens, look considerably more like class and moral judgment than any objective standard of childhood welfare. A mother's social conduct, her friendships, her travel habits, her perceived adherence to conventional domestic norms, all of this remained legally relevant to a 1934 judge deciding fitness, in a way that gave wealthy, socially connected opposing parties enormous latitude to construct a damaging portrait using exactly the kind of testimony Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's legal team assembled against Gloria. Legal scholars examining custody law's evolution across the 20th century have pointed to cases like this one, prominent, thoroughly publicized, and decided on grounds that blurred the line between genuine child welfare concerns and simple moral disapproval of a mother's personal life, as part of what eventually pushed American family law toward the more structured, evidence-based standards that developed in the following decades. The best interests of the child standard that dominates American custody law today, imperfect as its application remains, developed in part as a response to exactly the kind of loosely defined, morally freighted fitness determinations that shaped outcomes like Gloria's in the 1930s. None of this legal evolution arrived in time to help Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt herself, of course. She lived and lost her case entirely within the older framework, one where a judge's broad discretion, informed heavily by a legal team's ability to construct a damaging narrative, and by the surrounding culture's willingness to believe it, determined a 10-year-old's future and, in the process, permanently reshaped her mother's entire remaining life. The law changed. It changed too late to matter for the specific family whose very public suffering had helped prompt some of that change. If you have followed this channel through some of our other coverage of women who married into extraordinary American and European fortunes, you will recognize the underlying shape of Gloria's story, even beneath its specific details. Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, moved through 7 marriages, searching for a stability her own inherited fortune could never quite provide her, and died in genuinely diminished circumstances despite having been born one of the wealthiest women in the world. Jenny Jerome married into the Churchill family for what the London press of her own era insisted, quite incorrectly, was pure financial calculation, and spent decades fighting to be understood as something more than a transatlantic fortune hunter. Consuelo Vanderbilt herself, as we have already discussed at length, spent her first marriage locked into an arrangement she never chose before, eventually building a second life on her own terms. What separates Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt from nearly every other woman this channel has profiled in this particular corner of American and European high society is not the severity of what happened to her. Several of these women endured genuine cruelty, genuine loss, genuine public humiliation on a scale comparable to or exceeding what Gloria faced in 1934. What separates her is the completeness of the silence that followed. Barbara Hutton's later decline was itself extensively documented, covered by a press that never fully lost interest in her, even as her fortune dwindled. Jenny Jerome's life is preserved in exhaustive biographical detail, not least because her son grew up to become one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century, a fact that guaranteed permanent historical attention to his mother, regardless of her own individual accomplishments. Consuelo Vanderbilt's later decades as Madame Balsan generated their own substantial documentary record, philanthropic society coverage, memoirs, obituaries treating her death as a significant historical event. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt received none of that ongoing attention once the trial concluded. The 11 weeks of 1934 constitute, by an enormous margin, the best documented period of her entire life, more thoroughly recorded, in fact, than either her childhood, her brief marriage, or her 3 decades of widowhood combined. A woman who lived to 60 years old has a biographical record that is almost entirely front-loaded into a single autumn, a strange and genuinely unusual imbalance that tells you everything about how completely the public's interest in her began and ended with scandal, rather than with any sustained curiosity about who she actually was as a full human being living a full human life. It is worth giving Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney her own proper accounting here, because a story this focused on Gloria's loss can inadvertently flatten her sister-in-law into a simple antagonist, and the actual woman was considerably more complicated, and in her own right, considerably more historically significant than that flattened version allows. Gertrude was born in 1875, a daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and thus a member of the same immediate Vanderbilt branch that produced both Reginald and, through the wider family tree, Consuelo. She married Harry Payne Whitney, himself the heir to a separate enormous American fortune built on tobacco, banking, and racehorses, in 1896. A marriage that placed her among the wealthiest women in the entire country in her own right, independent of whatever she might eventually inherit from the Vanderbilt side. Unlike many women of her class and generation, Gertrude did not confine her adult life to the ordinary rounds of philanthropy and society, hosting that occupied most of her peers. She trained seriously as a sculptor, studied under recognized instructors, exhibited her own work publicly, and became a genuine patron of American artists at a moment when American art itself struggled for serious recognition against the dominance of European painting and sculpture in elite taste. In 1931, she founded the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, funding it substantially from her own fortune after major institutions had repeatedly declined her offer to donate her personal collection of contemporary American art. A rejection that reportedly stung enough to convince her to build an entirely independent institution, rather than continue seeking validation from museums that did not share her taste. That museum remains, nearly a century later, one of the most significant institutions dedicated to American art in the world. This is the woman who filed a custody petition against her own sister-in-law in 1934, and her biography matters to this story because it complicates the easy read of her motivations. Gertrude did not need the publicity the trial generated. If anything, the 11 weeks of tabloid coverage threatened the more serious, more carefully cultivated public reputation she had spent decades building as a patron of the arts, rather than a subject of scandal. She pursued the custody case anyway, at real cost to her own carefully constructed public image, which suggests, at minimum, a genuine conviction on her part that intervention was necessary, whatever the reputational risk to herself. It is possible, and probably true, that both things existed simultaneously inside this dispute. Gertrude may have held a genuine, well-founded concern for her niece's welfare, built from years of direct observation. She may also have carried, consciously or not, a certain confidence, born of her own considerable wealth and independent accomplishment, that her judgment about what a child needed simply outweighed her less independently successful sister-in-law's judgment on the same question. Wealth does not just buy better lawyers in a dispute like this one. It buys a party's own unshakable certainty that they are right, a certainty considerably harder to sustain when your own social and financial standing depends entirely on someone else's goodwill, the way Gloria's, by 1934, effectively did. The scale of coverage the trial received owed something, too, to a relatively new piece of media technology that had only recently become a fixture of ordinary American life: the movie theater newsreel. By 1934, millions of Americans encountered current events not only through newspapers and the still newer medium of radio, but through short-filmed segments shown before feature films in theaters across the country, footage of politicians, disasters, sporting events, and increasingly, courtroom spectacles significant enough to warrant film crews. The Vanderbilt custody trial generated exactly this kind of newsreel coverage, meaning that Americans who might never read a full newspaper transcript of the daily testimony could nonetheless watch moving images of the courthouse crowds, the arriving witnesses, and the small, solemn figure of the 10-year-old girl at the center of it all, projected on a screen before whatever film they had actually paid to see. This mattered enormously to how completely the story penetrated the national consciousness. A newspaper story, however extensively covered, still required literacy, purchase, and a degree of active engagement to consume. A newsreel required only a seat in a darkened theater and the willingness to watch whatever the projectionist had scheduled before the main feature, which meant the Vanderbilt trial reached Americans who might otherwise have had only passing awareness of a complicated legal dispute among people considerably wealthier than themselves. It became, through this newer visual medium, less a story you read about and more a story you had actually seen. Images of real people moving and speaking, a category of media experience that carried a different, more visceral kind of permanence in the public imagination than printed text alone ever could. That visual permanence is part of why the trial itself remains so much more thoroughly remembered, when it is remembered at all, than anything that happened to Gloria afterward. The newsreels stopped rolling the moment the verdict came down, and the story lost its dramatic tension. Nobody filmed Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt moving between smaller New York apartments through the 1940s and 50s, because there was no newsreel category for quiet, ordinary decline, no visual spectacle for a national audience conditioned to expect drama in installments to consume. The medium that had made her briefly the most visually documented private citizen in America had no mechanism whatsoever for documenting what came after, and so, in the most literal sense available to 1930s and 40s technology, the record of her life simply stopped being made. There is a financial thread running underneath this entire story that deserves its own direct attention, because it explains something important about how the younger Gloria eventually built the independent career and public identity that so thoroughly eclipsed her mother's name. The trust established under Reginald Vanderbilt's will for his infant daughter, the same trust structure that had left Gloria the mother with such comparatively modest personal income, matured over the following decades into a substantial inheritance for Gloria the daughter, one she gained increasing access to and control over as she reached adulthood. This inheritance, combined with the settlements from her series of marriages, gave the younger Gloria a level of independent financial security her own mother had never fully possessed, security that in turn gave her the freedom, decades later, to pursue design and business ventures without the same kind of precarious dependence on a fixed trust income that had shaped so much of her mother's adult life. There is a genuine irony worth sitting with here, one this channel tries to name honestly rather than let pass unremarked. The same family trust structure that had left Gloria the mother financially exposed and dependent, unable to match her sister-in-law's resources in a custody battle that took her daughter away from her, matured, a generation later, into the exact foundation of financial independence that allowed that same daughter to build an identity, a business empire, and a public reputation entirely her own, one that no court, no aunt, and no husband could take away from her the way custody of a child had once been taken from her mother. The system that failed the mother eventually delivered, however belatedly and however indirectly, real security to the daughter. Whether the younger Gloria Vanderbilt ever fully reckoned with that particular irony in her own writing is difficult to say with certainty, though her later memoirs do return repeatedly to questions of inheritance, both financial and emotional, in ways that suggest she understood, at some level, how directly her own eventual independence traced back to money her mother had never been permitted to control on her own behalf. The daughter built her name, in the most literal sense, on a foundation her mother had been denied access to during the exact years that foundation might have changed everything about how the custody trial itself unfolded. Return once more to the actual substance of what was said inside that courtroom across 11 weeks, because a fair accounting of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's story requires resisting the temptation to either dismiss every allegation as pure fabrication or accept every allegation as settled fact, and the honest position sits, uncomfortably, somewhere between those two extremes. Household staff testimony described a home environment marked by frequent absences, inconsistent routines, and a level of parental oversight that fell noticeably short of the structured, attentive standard the era's courts increasingly expected of mothers seeking to retain custody. Some of this testimony likely reflected genuine, observed reality rather than fabrication. Wealthy households of this era frequently did delegate the daily texture of child-rearing almost entirely to hired staff, and Gloria's household appears to have done so more completely, and with less direct maternal oversight, even at a distance, than many of her social peers. At the same time, the specific framing this testimony received, once filtered through opposing counsel's questioning and the press's subsequent reporting, consistently pushed toward the most damning possible interpretation available, treating ordinary features of upper-class parenting during this era, extensive reliance on nurses and governesses, frequent travel, an active social calendar, as though they were unique failures specific to Gloria rather than common practices across the entire social class both she and Gertrude Whitney occupied. Gertrude herself relied heavily on staff in raising her own children and stepchildren, and moved through an active, demanding public and social schedule throughout her adult life. The line the trial drew between acceptable delegation of child-rearing labor and unacceptable neglect tracked less with any objective standard applied consistently across both households, and more with which household the court, shaped by the specific allegations opposing counsel chose to emphasize, had already decided to view sympathetically. For the child at the actual center of all this argument, the experience of being discussed, analyzed, and judged by adults for 11 straight weeks left marks that surfaced repeatedly across her adult writing, decades after the fact. She wrote, in various memoirs published across her long life, about the strange sensation of growing into adulthood, carrying a story about herself that she had experienced almost entirely secondhand, through newspaper clippings and family retellings, rather than through her own clear childhood memory of events she had been too young to fully process while they happened. She wrote about feeling, for years afterward, as though two separate narratives existed about who she was, the poor little rich girl the newspapers had constructed, and the actual, considerably more ordinary, and considerably more confused child she remembered herself having been. Reconciling those two versions of her own childhood became, by her own account, a lifelong project that her considerable public success in adulthood never fully completed. That same difficulty, reconciling a public narrative with a more complicated private reality, defined her mother's entire remaining life as well, though Gloria the mother never achieved anything close to the public platform her daughter eventually built to work through it. The daughter got decades of memoirs, interviews, and a documentary specifically built around finally saying what had gone unsaid. The mother got 11 weeks of testimony that constructed a version of her the country accepted as settled fact, and then 30 years of silence in which she had no comparable platform, no comparable audience, and, increasingly, no comparable public interest available to help her offer any correction to the record at all. It is worth asking, directly, what Consuelo Vanderbilt herself made of all this, given how closely this entire video ties her name to Gloria's story. The honest answer is that the surviving record offers very little direct evidence either way. By 1934, Consuelo had already divorced the Duke of Marlborough, years earlier, and was living primarily in France and England, increasingly occupied with the philanthropic work and eventual second marriage to Jacques Balsan that would define her later decades. She was, geographically and socially, considerably removed from the day-to-day American tabloid machinery that consumed the Vanderbilt custody trial so completely. British and French papers covered the case, since it involved one of America's most famous family names, but with nothing like the saturation American coverage achieved, and there is no documented record of Consuelo issuing any public statement about her cousin by marriage's ordeal, supporting or otherwise. This absence of documented reaction is not, on its own, evidence of indifference. Family members frequently decline to comment publicly on each other's legal and personal difficulties, precisely to avoid adding fuel to an already overwhelming press fire, and Consuelo, having spent her own younger years enduring intense public scrutiny of her first marriage's unhappiness, may well have understood better than most exactly how counterproductive further public comment could be for a relative already drowning in unwanted attention. It is equally possible that the two women, connected only by marriage and by a family tree with dozens of branches, simply were not close enough personally for either woman's crisis to register as a matter requiring the other's public response. The Vanderbilt family, by the 1930s, had grown far too large and far too dispersed across its own internal branches for every member to maintain close personal ties with every cousin, whether by blood or by marriage, carrying the family name. What we can say with confidence is that the two women's paths, so similar in their broad shape, a marriage entered too young into a fortune that promised more security than it delivered, a public ordeal that reshaped the rest of each woman's life, never appear to have intersected in any documented, meaningful way beyond the accident of family connection this video's title invokes. They lived their defining crises roughly a decade apart, on opposite sides of an ocean, inside completely separate social ecosystems, and arrived at completely different endings. One a celebrated philanthropist whose death made international news. The other, a woman whose death barely registered outside her own immediate family. It is worth pausing directly on why a detail like the boarding house, unsupported by the actual documented record, tends to attach itself to stories like this one in the first place, because understanding that tendency tells you something important about how popular history actually gets made and passed along. A boarding house carries an immediately legible symbolic weight in American cultural memory, a specific, working-class image of reduced circumstances, shared walls, a rented room among strangers, the precise opposite of everything the Vanderbilt name was built to represent. It is a detail that does not need explaining to a listener. Everyone understands, instantly, exactly what it means for a Vanderbilt to die in one, and that instant legibility is precisely what makes the detail so tempting to include, verified or not, whenever this story gets retold. In comment sections, in half-remembered family anecdotes, in the kind of casual, unsourced retelling that spreads far more easily online than the more careful, considerably less tidy documented version ever does. The actual truth, small rented apartments, a shrinking trust income, a quiet, undocumented final decade, carries the same underlying meaning, dramatic reversal of fortune, social erasure, a name that outlived the woman's actual place in the world, without needing the extra dramatic flourish of a literal boarding house to communicate it. If anything, the true version is more unsettling precisely because it resists the tidy symbolism a boarding house provides. There is no single dramatic image, no clean visual shorthand, for what actually happened to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. There is only a long, slow, quiet withdrawal from public relevance, unfolding across 3 decades, with no single scene dramatic enough to anchor a legend, which is exactly why the more vivid, invented version keeps circulating in place of it. Human memory and human storytelling both prefer a sharp, specific image over an accurate but diffuse decline, and this story, like so many others in the Vanderbilt family's long history, has had its rougher edges sanded down and its details sharpened into something more dramatically satisfying than the actual record supports every time it gets passed along. This channel would rather tell you the less tidy version and let it sit exactly as uncomfortable as it actually is, because the true story does not need embellishment to earn your attention. A 17-year-old bride, a widow at 21. A mother stripped of her only child in the most watched custody trial in American history to that point. 3 decades of genuine, undramatic, undocumented obscurity. A death that generated a handful of paragraphs rather than a single meaningful obituary. That is the actual shape of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's life, and it is devastating enough exactly as it happened, without needing a fictional boarding house to make the point. There is a physical, visitable illustration of exactly how unevenly this story's 2 central women were remembered, and you can walk through it yourself if you happen to find yourself in New York. The Whitney Museum of American Art, the institution Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney founded with her own money and her own conviction that American artists deserved a permanent home, still operates today, having relocated in recent years into a striking new building in the meatpacking district, drawing visitors by the millions annually to view a collection built substantially around Gertrude's own original taste and acquisitions. Her name endures, quite literally, as a functioning cultural institution nearly a century after her death, actively shaping which American artists new generations of museum-goers encounter for the first time. Nothing comparable exists anywhere carrying Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's name. No foundation, no wing, no scholarship, no institution of any kind preserves her memory in the active, ongoing way the Whitney Museum preserves Gertrude's. This is not, to be entirely fair, evidence of any injustice specific to the custody trial itself, since Gloria never possessed anything close to the independent fortune that allowed Gertrude to fund an entire museum in the first place. But it does illustrate, with a stark physical clarity that words alone can struggle to capture, exactly how permanently one woman's resources translated into permanent cultural memory, while the other woman's more modest circumstances translated into near-total historical erasure. Money did not just win the custody case in 1934. It won the far longer, far quieter contest over which of these 2 women's names, an ordinary American, walking through a museum 8 decades later, would ever have reason to encounter again. The newspaper competition that drove the trial's saturation coverage in the first place deserves its own brief accounting as well, because 1934, New York supported an unusually crowded newspaper marketplace, and that competitive pressure shaped exactly how aggressively each outlet pursued the story. Multiple major dailies competed directly for the same readership across the city, each one incentivized to run the most dramatic possible framing of each day's testimony in order to outsell its rivals on the newsstand. This competitive pressure, more than any single editor's individual decision, explains why coverage of the trial reached the saturation level it did, and why the resulting public narrative skewed so consistently toward the most damning possible interpretation of every piece of testimony. A more restrained, more careful account of ambiguous testimony simply did not sell newspapers as effectively as a definitive, dramatic one did. And in a city with this many outlets fighting for the same readers, restraint was rarely the commercially rational choice for any individual editor to make, whatever the human cost to the people being covered. It is worth asking, carefully and without pretending to any certainty the record does not support, what might have happened differently for Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt if a handful of specific facts had broken the other way. Had Reginald lived even another decade, his own greater personal stability and the direct financial security of an intact marriage, rather than a contested widow's trust, might well have prevented the custody dispute from ever reaching a courtroom in the first place. Had Gloria commanded legal and financial resources closer to Gertrude's own, the trial's outcome, or at minimum its public framing, might have looked considerably different, since so much of what damaged her reputation traced not to objectively proven fact, but to which side could more effectively construct and publicize its preferred narrative across 11 weeks of daily coverage. Had the tender years doctrine of custody law carried the kind of firmer, evidence-based protections that developed only in later decades, a judge in 1934 might have required a considerably higher bar of proven unfitness before removing a child from her mother's care at all. None of these counterfactuals happened. We raise them not to rewrite history, but to make a specific point about how contingent this entire story actually was. How many separate factors, a husband's drinking, a family's uneven distribution of wealth across generations, a specific judge's discretion, a specific era's custody standards, a specific newspaper market's competitive pressures, had to align in exactly the way they did in order to produce the particular outcome this video has spent the last hour tracing. Change any one of those factors, and Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's story might read today as an ordinary, private family matter, resolved without incident, and never remembered by anyone outside her immediate circle, rather than as either the 11-week national sensation it briefly became, or the 3 decades of near-total obscurity that followed it. That contingency is itself worth sitting with, because it undercuts the tempting, tidy narrative that Gloria simply deserved what happened to her, that some clear personal failing on her part explains and justifies both the trial's outcome and the decades of forgetting that followed. The actual record does not support that cleaner verdict. It supports a considerably messier one, a young woman married too early into a fading fortune, failed by a legal and media system built to punish exactly the kind of ambiguous, imperfect parenting that wealthier, better-resourced families like her sister-in-laws rarely faced comparable public scrutiny for, and then abandoned by a public whose attention had never actually been about her welfare in the first place, only about the entertainment value of watching her lose it. There was, in fact, one deliberate attempt by Gloria herself to reclaim some control over her own story, and it deserves proper attention here because it complicates the picture of pure passive silence this video might otherwise leave you with. In 1958, more than 2 decades after the custody trial, Gloria and her twin sister Thelma jointly published a memoir titled Double Exposure, an account of their shared childhood, their parallel and often intertwined adult lives, and, inevitably, the 2 defining catastrophes each of them had lived through: Thelma's loss of the Prince of Wales to Wallis Simpson, and Gloria's loss of her daughter in the custody trial. The book represented a genuine attempt by both sisters, working together, to narrate their own history in their own words, rather than continuing to let newspapers and the passage of time settle the final version on their behalf. The memoir received a modest amount of attention upon publication, enough for reviews in several major outlets, curious readers interested in revisiting 2 once famous names from a bygone era of high society scandal. It did not, however, restore either sister to anything resembling their earlier prominence, and within a relatively short period after publication, the book itself settled into the same kind of quiet, specialist obscurity that had already claimed most of the rest of Gloria's post-trial life. It remains, today, a resource primarily consulted by biographers and historians researching this exact story, rather than a widely read or widely remembered work of its own moment. There is something genuinely poignant in the fact that Gloria did try, once, directly, to tell her own version of events, and that even this direct effort was not enough to change the trajectory her public reputation had already settled into a quarter-century earlier. The 11 weeks of 1934 had done their work so thoroughly, and the intervening decades of silence had allowed that work to calcify so completely into settled public memory, that a genuine first-person account published under her own name, telling her own side of the story in her own words, simply could not generate enough renewed public interest to meaningfully shift the narrative the newspapers had already fixed permanently in place a generation earlier. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the more damning details in this entire account. It would be one thing if Gloria had simply never attempted to correct the record, if her 3 decades of silence had been entirely involuntary, imposed on her by circumstance, rather than any failure of effort on her own part. Instead, the record shows a woman who did try, who sat down with her own sister and produced an actual published account of her own life and her own understanding of what had happened to her, and who discovered that the public that had once consumed her downfall in exhaustive daily detail simply had no comparable appetite for consuming her own account of survival. The scandal had been news. The correction was not. Later comprehensive histories of the Vanderbilt family, the kind of sweeping multi-generational accounts that trace the fortune from the Commodore's shipping empire through its eventual dispersal across dozens of descendants, tend to treat Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt in a way that mirrors, almost exactly, the pattern this entire video has been describing. She appears, reliably, in the section covering the 1934 trial, discussed at whatever length that particular author judges the scandal deserves. She then largely disappears from the narrative for the remaining 3 decades of her actual life, her name resurfacing only briefly, if at all, to mark her 1965 death, before the account moves on to trace her far more extensively documented daughter's later career instead. Even historians working specifically to reconstruct this family's full, complicated story have, collectively, replicated the exact same imbalance the contemporary press first created, treating Gloria's scandal as the whole of her significance, and her subsequent 3 decades as barely worth a paragraph. This is not, to be fair to those historians, entirely a failure of effort or empathy on their part. It reflects, in large part, the simple scarcity of documented source material available for those later decades, the same scarcity this video itself has had to work around throughout its own final chapters. A historian can only write in detail about what the surviving record actually documents, and the surviving record for Gloria's post-trial life is genuinely thin, scattered across family recollections, occasional legal filings, and the retrospective accounts her daughter provided decades later, rather than the dense, daily contemporary coverage available for almost every other phase of her life. The historiography reflects the archive, and the archive itself reflects exactly the pattern of public attention this video has traced from the beginning: intense scrutiny during scandal, near total silence afterward. Breaking that pattern, even partially, even 8 decades later, in a video like this one, requires deliberately choosing to spend time on the thin, quiet decades, rather than rushing past them toward a tidier ending, focused entirely on the dramatic courtroom material. We have tried to do exactly that throughout this account, not because the trial itself lacks importance, it clearly shaped everything that followed, but because a woman's entire life deserves more than a single autumn's worth of attention, however dramatic that autumn happened to be. The verdict on this entire story, the one you actually came here for, starts with 2 corrections, because accuracy matters more to this channel than a clean headline, and both corrections change the story in ways worth holding on to, rather than treating as minor footnotes. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was not Consuelo Vanderbilt's cousin by blood. She became family through her marriage to Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt, Consuelo's actual first cousin, which makes her connection to the more famous Duchess of Marlborough real, documented, and considerably more distant than the phrase Consuelo's cousin implies on its own. And the historical record does not support the specific claim that she died in a literal boarding house. What it supports instead is a woman who spent her final decade in small, shrinking, anonymous rented rooms, financially diminished by any standard the Vanderbilt name implied, though never destitute in the strictest sense of that word, and who died in 1965 with almost none of the public attention that had once made her, briefly, the single most discussed private citizen in America. Now hold those corrections against everything else this hour has actually shown you, because the corrected version of this story is, if anything, more affecting than the invented one, not less. A 17-year-old girl, raised by a diplomat father to understand marriage as the primary vehicle by which a woman without independent wealth secured her place in the world, married a man 25 years her senior, who had already burned through 2 prior marriages and was steadily running out of the fortune his own name implied he possessed in abundance. She became a mother at 18, a widow at 20, and by 30 found herself the losing party in the most publicly consumed custody trial the country had ever witnessed. Her private friendships, her parenting, her entire character dissected daily by lawyers, reporters, and a national audience that had far more urgent problems of its own to worry about, and chose, instead, to spend 11 straight weeks watching a Vanderbilt widow's life come apart in serialized installments. She lost her daughter to a wealthier, more independently accomplished relative whose own motives, whatever their genuine concern for a child's welfare, were never separable from the simple structural fact that money buys not just better lawyers, but a kind of unshakable social certainty that ordinary financial precarity can never quite match. She tried, once, decades later, to tell her own version of events in a memoir written jointly with her twin sister, and discovered that a public capable of consuming her downfall in exhaustive daily detail had no comparable interest in consuming her own account of survival. She watched her only daughter grow into one of the most famous women in America, carrying forward the exact 3 words, Gloria Vanderbilt, that had once belonged to her first, until those words stopped meaning her entirely, and started meaning someone else. And she died, at 60, in reduced circumstances that history barely bothered to record, a full 3 decades after the entire country had known her name. That is not a story that needs an invented boarding house to earn its place in this channel's coverage of the Vanderbilt family's long, complicated history. It needs, if anything, less embellishment than most of the family's other famous chapters, because the true shape of it already carries everything a story like this one is supposed to carry. A young woman married for security that never actually materialized. A family fortune that had already begun dissolving before she ever arrived to claim a share of it. A public and a press that consumed her private catastrophe as entertainment and then discarded her the moment the entertainment value ran out. And a name that survived only because someone else, someone she raised and then lost, and then, imperfectly, partially found her way back to, carried it forward into a fame she herself would never live to see. There is one last piece of this story worth telling, because it offers something closer to a genuine, if very late, correction than anything else this account has covered. In 2021, Anderson Cooper, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's own great-grandson through her daughter, published a book, written together with the historian Catherine Howe, tracing the entire rise and fall of the Vanderbilt dynasty, from the Commodore's earliest shipping ventures through the family's long 20th century decline. The book became a bestseller, introducing the full sweep of this family's history, including the custody trial and its long aftermath, to a wide contemporary readership that had, by that point, mostly forgotten the details, even of the parts of the story that once dominated front pages for 11 straight weeks. There is something significant in the fact that it took 4 generations, and the direct effort of a descendant who had grown up hearing this story second-hand through his own mother's complicated memories, to finally place Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's full life back into a serious, comprehensive historical account, rather than leaving her permanently confined to a single dramatic chapter about a trial. Anderson Cooper did not know his own great-grandmother personally. She died 6 years before he was born. Everything he understood about her came filtered through his mother's decades of processing, through Barbara Goldsmith's earlier research, through the same scattered archival fragments any historian working this material has to rely on. And yet he chose, as an adult with a public platform his own great-grandmother never had access to spend real time and real research effort making sure her story, the full 3 decades of it, and not merely the 11 dramatic weeks, finally reached a wide audience with something closer to the care and context it had always deserved. That is, in its own way, the closest thing this story has to a happy ending. Not restoration exactly, since nothing can restore to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt the decades of obscurity she actually lived through, or the daughter she spent years partially, imperfectly reconciling with, rather than simply raising without interruption. But a kind of overdue attention, arriving generations later, from a family member with both the resources and the genuine motivation to make sure the full record, not just the scandal, finally got told properly. This channel is doing the same thing tonight, on a considerably smaller scale, and that is precisely the point of telling stories like this one at all. Think back to that photograph from the opening of this video, the 17-year-old girl laughing on the deck of a ship crossing toward Paris, standing beside a man 25 years her senior, who was already, steadily, running out of everything his name promised her. She did not know, in that moment, what any of it would eventually cost her. Almost nobody in that position ever does. The name that promised her safety delivered, instead, 11 weeks of public dismantling and 3 decades of complete silence, and by the time she died, the same 3 words that had once opened every door in American society had already begun belonging, permanently, to somebody else. Consuelo Vanderbilt got remembered. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney got a museum. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt got a photograph almost nobody has seen in 100 years, a courtroom transcript most people have never read, and a daughter who spent the rest of her own very long, very famous life trying, imperfectly and honestly, to make sure her mother was not entirely forgotten. This channel just spent the last 2.5 hours making sure of that too. Before we close this out, the exact phrase the press attached to young Gloria, poor little rich girl, was not invented specifically for her. It had already circulated in American popular culture for years by the time newspapers applied it to a 10-year-old caught in a custody battle. And it would go on, within the following decade, to attach itself to another wealthy young woman this channel has already covered in detail, Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress whose own life became a virtual case study in the same phenomenon, enormous inherited wealth, failing to translate into anything resembling personal security or lasting happiness. The recurrence of that exact phrase, applied to different heiresses across different wealthy American families in different decades, tells you something important about the culture's underlying relationship to inherited fortune during this era. Readers wanted, apparently needed, a recurring cast of tragic wealthy women whose money could not buy them what money was supposed to buy, proof, delivered regularly and reliably, that the ordinary American reader's own more modest, more difficult life was not, after all, the worst bargain. Gloria's mother never received that exact label herself, since the phrase attached specifically to children rather than adult women, but she lived, in effect, as the origin point of the exact story that label eventually came to represent. She had been, briefly, the glamorous young bride the fairy tale demanded. She became, through no fully explicable fault of her own, the cautionary tale the culture apparently needed to balance out the fairy tale it had just finished telling. Both roles, the fairy tale bride and the cautionary tale mother, existed in the public imagination almost entirely independent of who Gloria Morgan actually was as a full human being, shaped instead by whatever narrative function a given decade's newspapers required from a Vanderbilt woman at any particular moment. There is a version of this exact pattern still operating today, and it is worth naming directly rather than pretending this is purely a historical phenomenon confined to the 1930s. Contemporary culture has its own version of the 11-week trial by newspaper, compressed now into days or even hours rather than weeks, playing out across social media rather than front pages, but built on the same underlying mechanism, a private individual's most difficult moment converted into public entertainment, consumed intensely and briefly by an audience that moves on the instant a fresher story arrives, leaving the actual person at the center of it to live with consequences the audience itself never has to think about again. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt lived through an early, unusually well-documented version of a pattern that has, if anything, only intensified and accelerated in the 90 years since her own trial briefly consumed the entire country's attention. There is a broader question sitting underneath this entire 2.5 hours, one worth asking directly before we close, because it applies well beyond this single family and this single forgotten woman. What actually determines whether history remembers someone? It is tempting to assume the answer is simple, that significance determines memory, that people who did important, consequential things get remembered, while people who did not fade away, and that the process operates something like a fair, if imperfect, meritocracy of historical importance. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's life argues against that assumption almost completely. She did nothing especially unusual by the standards of her own social class and her own era. She married, she had a child, she lost a legal battle many mothers before and since have also lost, and she lived out an ordinary widowhood on a fixed income for 3 decades afterward. None of that, on its own, should have made her either famous or forgotten. What actually determined both outcomes, briefly famous and then permanently forgotten, was almost entirely accidental. Which family she happened to marry into, which newspapers happened to be competing for readers in 1934 New York, which new visual technology happened to be reaching mass audiences at exactly that moment, and which of her own relatives happened to possess the independent fortune and cultural ambition to build a permanent institution, a museum, carrying her name forward, while she herself had no comparable resource available to do the same for her own memory. Historical memory, in other words, does not simply record significance. It records resources, timing, and the particular institutional and technological infrastructure available to preserve one person's story, while another equally significant, equally real life simply evaporates for lack of anyone with the means or the motivation to write it down and keep it written down across the following decades. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt is not a special case in this regard. She is, if anything, an unusually well-documented example of what is actually the historical norm. The vast majority of every generation's private lives, wealthy or otherwise, simply disappearing from any lasting record the moment the people who remembered them personally are themselves gone. If you want to go deeper into this story than a single video can cover, Barbara Goldsmith's book from 1980 remains the single most thorough contemporary account of the trial itself, built from court records and first-hand interviews conducted while many participants were still alive to speak with her directly. Anderson Cooper and Catherine Howe's more recent book places this story properly within the full multi-generational sweep of the entire Vanderbilt family, from the Commodore through to the present day. And the HBO documentary from 2016 offers the closest thing available to Gloria's own daughter speaking, in her own late-in-life words, about a mother the world had mostly stopped thinking about, decades before either of them ever sat down for that conversation. None of those sources will fully resolve every unanswered question this story still carries. The exact nature of Gloria's friendship with Nada Milford Haven remains genuinely unsettled. The precise circumstances of her final illness in 1965 remain thinly documented. Whole years of her middle life remain effectively blank in the historical record, undocumented not because nothing happened during them, but because nobody with the means or the motivation to record it was paying attention anymore. That incompleteness is not a failure of this video's research. It is the actual, honest shape of what remains knowable about a woman the culture decided, collectively, and without ever quite announcing the decision, to stop watching. Lay the whole timeline out once more, in order, because a story with this many turns deserves to be held in your mind as a single continuous life, rather than a series of disconnected dramatic scenes. Born in Lucerne in 1904, one half of an identical pair raised across a series of European diplomatic postings that gave both girls polish, without ever giving either one of them independent fortune. Married at 17, in Paris, to a man 25 years older, already twice divorced, already drinking his way through a trust income that could not keep pace with his own spending. A daughter born at 18, widowed at 20, a decade of transatlantic society, close friendships, mounting financial strain, hidden behind a name that still opened every door, regardless of what stood behind it. A custody petition filed by a wealthier, more independently accomplished sister-in-law in 1933. 11 weeks of trial, beginning in the autumn of 1934, front-page coverage every single day, newsreel footage in movie theaters across the country, a 10-year-old daughter photographed arriving and leaving the courthouse in near-total silence. A verdict that removed the child from her mother's custody while granting limited visitation, reported by the press as considerably more damning than the judge's actual written findings supported. 30 years of quiet, undocumented decline, shrinking apartments, a fixed trust income that never grew to match the cost of the life the name still implied, a daughter growing into her own independent fame, while the mother who had once eclipsed the entire country's attention slipped steadily further from anyone's notice. One genuine attempt at self-narration, a joint memoir with her twin sister in 1958, that failed to meaningfully restore her public standing. A death in 1965, at 60 years old, quiet, thinly documented, largely unremarked by a press that had once tracked her every movement. And then, more than half a century later, a great-grandson she never met, working from fragments, family memory, and the same scattered archival record every historian of this story has had to rely on, finally placed her back into a comprehensive account of the family whose name had cost her so much and given her, in the end, comparatively little to hold on to. That is the whole shape of it, start to finish, corrected where the historical record demanded correction, and told, we hope, with something closer to the full weight and complexity this woman's actual life deserved, rather than the flattened, sensational version that has circulated in its place for the better part of a century. A story like this earns 2.5 hours of your evening for reasons that have little to do with historical importance in the textbook sense. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt did not change the world. She did not invent anything, lead anything, or accomplish anything a history textbook would ever find room for. She lived, by any objective measure, an ordinary life inside extraordinary circumstances. A woman who married, mothered, lost, and endured in ways that millions of women across every decade of American history have also married, mothered, lost, and endured, most of them without a single newspaper ever printing their name. The reason this particular ordinary life deserves your attention is precisely because the circumstances around it were so extraordinary, and because those circumstances happened to generate, for 11 specific weeks in 1934, an unusually detailed record of exactly how a family, a court system, and a national press corps could combine to dismantle one private woman's reputation almost entirely, and then, having extracted every possible ounce of dramatic value from that dismantling, simply walk away and leave her to live out the actual consequences alone, for 30 years, largely unwitnessed. That is not a uniquely 1930s phenomenon. It is a permanent, recurring feature of how public attention interacts with private catastrophe, one this channel has traced through dozens of other stories, set in dozens of other decades, and Gloria's version of it happens to be unusually well preserved, unusually well documented, which makes it unusually well suited to actually examining the mechanism closely, rather than simply gesturing at it in the abstract. There is also, underneath all of that, a considerably simpler and considerably more human reason this story matters. A mother lost her daughter. A daughter lost her mother, in every meaningful sense, at 10 years old, in a courtroom, while adults argued about which of them deserved to raise her. Both of them spent the rest of their very different, very unequal lives trying, in their own ways, to make peace with a loss neither of them had chosen and neither of them could fully undo. That particular kind of grief, the loss of a parent or a child, not to death but to circumstance, to legal process, to a family and a culture that decided, on their behalf, how their relationship would be allowed to proceed from that point forward, is not confined to Vanderbilts. It is not confined to the 1930s. It is happening, in some family court somewhere in this country, right now, tonight, to people whose names will never appear in any newspaper at all. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's story got told, however imperfectly, however one-sidedly, however much the true final decades of it had to wait nearly a century for anyone to properly reconstruct them. Most stories like hers never get told at all. That, more than the Vanderbilt name, more than the 11 weeks of tabloid drama, more than the museum one sister-in-law built, and the obscurity the other sister-in-law endured, is probably the real reason this particular story earned its place on this channel tonight, and the real reason it is worth remembering, correctly and completely, rather than letting the more dramatic, less accurate version keep circulating unchallenged. She was not Consuelo Vanderbilt's cousin by blood. She did not die in a boarding house. She was a 17-year-old bride who became, briefly, the most watched woman in America, and then spent 30 years disappearing so completely that most people alive today have never once heard her name. Now you have. There is one more thread worth pulling before we close, and it goes back to the very beginning of this story, to two identical faces born within minutes of each other in a Swiss city in 1904. Identical twins occupy a particular place in the popular imagination, treated almost instinctively as a single unit with interchangeable fates, and the press of Gloria and Thelma's youth leaned into that instinct constantly, photographing them together, dressing them alike, referring to them collectively as the magnificent Morgans, as though they shared not just a face, but a single trajectory through life. What actually happened to these two women demonstrates, about as clearly as any single case history could, exactly how little a shared birth, a shared face, and a shared upbringing actually guarantees about how two lives eventually unfold. Thelma's path took her to the edge of the British throne, and then, through no clean fault of her own, away from it, into a long remaining life as a minor historical footnote to somebody else's far more famous romance. Gloria's path took her into the single most publicized fortune in America, and then, through a combination of genuine circumstance and genuine misfortune, into a legal disaster that made her briefly the most watched private citizen in the country, before dropping her into 3 decades of near total silence. Same face. Same childhood. Same training in how to convert beauty and continental polish into a secure future through marriage. Completely different endings, separated not by any difference in the two women's fundamental character, so much as by the specific, largely uncontrollable circumstances each of them happened to marry into. There is something worth sitting with in that fact, for anyone inclined to read a story like this one as a morality tale, a clean lesson about personal choices leading directly to personal consequences. Two women, functionally identical at the starting line by any measure the era considered relevant, ended up in two of the most different possible places a woman of their class and generation could land. One a permanent, if minor, fixture in the history of the British monarchy, the other functionally erased from the historical record entirely within a single generation. If character and choice fully explained outcomes, identical twins raised in an identical household should have produced considerably more identical results than these two women actually did. They did not, and the gap between their two endings is, in its own way, the clearest possible illustration of everything this video has spent the last 2.5 hours trying to demonstrate. Circumstance, timing, and the particular family a woman happened to marry into mattered enormously more than any inherent quality either Morgan twin actually possessed. Gloria did not fail some test that Thelma passed. She married a man whose fortune was already thinning and whose habits were already destructive, at a moment in American legal and media history when a public custody dispute could be transformed into 11 weeks of national entertainment at her direct personal expense. Thelma married differently, into a different set of circumstances, and lost her own claim to prominence through an entirely separate mechanism. A single, unguarded moment of trust, extended to the wrong friend at the wrong time. Neither twin chose the ending she got. Both endings, nonetheless, became permanently attached to their names, the record history eventually settled on and largely stopped revisiting. That is, perhaps, the truest and hardest lesson this entire story actually has to offer, harder even than the specific facts of the custody trial itself. The margin between a life history remembers and a life history lets go of is very often considerably thinner and considerably more arbitrary than any of us would like to believe. Justice, in the strictest sense, never actually arrived for Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. Not in the courtroom sense, since the 1934 ruling was never overturned, never seriously challenged again, and stood, formally, as the final legal word on her fitness as a mother for the rest of her life. But in the quieter, more human sense, the record does offer something, not vindication exactly, but a kind of partial, imperfect repair that arrived across the following decades in pieces rather than all at once. Her daughter, once grown, did not simply accept the 1934 verdict as settled truth and move on without ever revisiting it. She spent decades, across multiple memoirs, and eventually that final HBO documentary, actively working to understand her mother as a full person rather than as the cautionary figure the trial had reduced her to. Whatever the exact texture of their relationship across the years between the verdict and Gloria the mother's death in 1965, the daughter's later, sustained effort to reconstruct and honor her mother's fuller story suggests that whatever repair proved possible between them did, eventually, at least partially occur. That repair came too late to change anything about how the wider public understood Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt during her own remaining lifetime. She died still carrying, in the eyes of whatever fraction of the country still remembered her name at all, the reputation the 1934 trial had constructed, rather than any more complete or more forgiving account of who she actually was. The correction, when it eventually came from her own family, decades after her death, rather than from the press or the public that had done the original damage. Newspapers do not generally issue corrections to reputations they destroyed 90 years earlier. Families sometimes do, if they live long enough and care enough, and eventually find themselves with enough distance from the original scandal to look back honestly rather than defensively. That is not the same thing as justice in any formal sense. It is perhaps the only kind of justice a story like this one was ever actually going to receive, a quiet, decades-late reckoning within the family itself, eventually reaching a wider audience only because a great-grandson with his own public platform decided her full story deserved to be told properly, and because this channel, and others like it, keep returning to figures like Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt precisely because the historical record so rarely gives women in her position anything close to a fair final accounting on its own. We have tried to give her one tonight. Whether we have succeeded is, as always, for you to judge, and we genuinely want to hear your honest reaction in the comments below. Agreement, disagreement, additional context we might have missed, all of it. There is a particular kind of irony worth naming in closing, one that applies to every forgotten figure this channel ever chooses to cover, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt very much included. The moment a video like this one exists, the moment her name sits in a title read by thousands or millions of viewers, the word forgotten stops being fully accurate. She is, in this very specific and admittedly limited sense, no longer forgotten at all. You now know her name, her marriage, her trial, her 30 years of quiet decline, and her eventual death, in more detail than the vast majority of people who have ever heard the phrase Gloria Vanderbilt could offer you if you asked them right now, on the street, who the first Gloria Vanderbilt actually was. That does not undo the 90 years of near-total silence that preceded this video, and it does not restore to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt herself any of what she actually lost while she was alive to feel the loss of it, her daughter's daily presence, her own public reputation, the 3 decades of relevance the country simply declined to extend to her once the entertainment value of her downfall had been fully consumed. History cannot be rewound to give a woman back what a courtroom, a press corps, and an indifferent public already took from her nearly a century ago. But history can, at least, be corrected going forward. One retelling at a time, one accurate account replacing one inaccurate legend. One video like this one, choosing to spend 2.5 hours on a woman most channels would compress into a single dramatic minute about a scandalous trial and nothing else. That correction is the actual point of everything you just watched. Not simply to entertain you with another old money scandal, though we hope it did that too, but to put back into the historical record a woman whose full life deserved considerably more careful attention than either her own era or the decades immediately following it ever gave her. She was not merely a scandal, and she was not merely a footnote to her more famous daughter. She was a full, complicated, genuinely unlucky human being who lived 17 to 60 years the way most human beings live their lives, doing her best with circumstances she had not chosen and could not fully control, and she deserved, at minimum, to be remembered accurately rather than left to be misremembered, invented, or simply erased. Consider it done, at least for tonight, at least by this small corner of the internet, at least for however many of you made it all the way to this final sentence. Wire services carried daily dispatches from that courtroom to papers across the entire country, meaning a reader in a small town in the Midwest or the Deep South, someone who had never set foot in New York and never would, could follow the Vanderbilt custody trial with nearly the same day-by-day detail as a reader standing outside the courthouse itself. That reach mattered enormously to how completely the story embedded itself in the national consciousness, rather than remaining a purely regional New York sensation. A scandal confined to one city's papers fades from memory considerably faster than one distributed, and day after day, into households from Maine to California, each one absorbing the same damaging headlines with no independent way to verify how fairly those headlines actually reflected the courtroom testimony behind them. The nationwide wire distribution is, in its own quiet way, as responsible for the permanence of Gloria's damaged reputation as anything said inside the courtroom itself, because it guaranteed that virtually the entire literate American public encountered some version of her story, all of them absorbing roughly the same simplified, unfavorable narrative, regardless of which specific paper happened to land on their own doorstep that particular morning. One final note on the phrase you will still occasionally see attached to this case, the trial of the century. It is worth knowing that this exact phrase has been applied, across the 20th century alone, to a genuinely long list of unrelated legal proceedings. The Scopes Evolution trial in 1925, the Lindbergh kidnapping prosecution in 1935, the Rosenberg espionage trial in the early 1950s, and eventually, decades later, an entirely different sensational case that most contemporary audiences now assume the phrase was originally coined for. Contemporary newspapers reached for that exact label constantly, almost reflexively, whenever a case generated enough sustained public fascination, which tells you something useful about how genuinely common this specific kind of media spectacle actually was across the century, rather than treating the Vanderbilt custody case as some singular, unrepeatable anomaly. It was extraordinary. It was also, in its underlying shape, one entry in a long, recurring pattern of American legal proceedings, transformed into mass entertainment, a pattern this channel will keep tracing through other families, other decades, and other women whose private catastrophes became, briefly, everyone's business before becoming, just as quickly, nobody's concern at all. If this story moved you even a fraction as much as researching and writing it moved us, do 3 things before you close this tab or move on to whatever video comes next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel is building a genuine, ongoing archive of exactly these overlooked corners of America's great fortunes: the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys, the Kennedys, and dozens of other families whose public legend rarely matches their private, considerably messier reality, and we release new deep dives like this one every single week. Give this video a like if you made it all the way through, because it genuinely helps a channel like ours reach more people who care about getting this history right, rather than settling for the shorter, punchier, less accurate version that usually wins the algorithm. And leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you watched this from tonight, and whether you had ever heard Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's name before this video, or whether, like most people, the only Gloria Vanderbilt you knew before tonight was the one on the back pocket of a pair of jeans. Let us know, too, which other forgotten woman from this family, or from any of the other great American dynasties, you want us to dig into next, because a genuine number of our most successful recent videos started as exactly that kind of suggestion, sitting in a comment section, until enough of you asked for the same thing. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt spent 30 years being forgotten by a country that had once, briefly, been unable to look away from her. Tonight, for 2.5 hours, you looked. That is not nothing. For a woman history spent 9 decades trying its best to erase, it might, in the end, be exactly enough. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next one.